Hi, everyone, and good morning if you are in the United States. Good afternoon, good evening if you are abroad somewhere in the east of us. I'm very happy to welcome you all. My name is Marcelo Gleiser. I am the director of the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement here at Dartmouth College, and we are essentially holding this conference since yesterday. In case you haven't seen anything, we invite you to go to our website page, which is ice.dartmouth.edu, and you can click on Watch the Friday Talks, and they're all there for you. So in case you missed anything, in case you want to go back to listen to some of them, you're welcome to do that, of course, at any time. And for those of you who are new to the conference, let me just remind you a little bit about what the topics are before we introduce our first speaker of this morning, which is Sir Martin Rees, and he's supposed to be starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the talks that we have gathered here together all focus on a very grand question, which is the future of humanity, and from a scientific and humanistic perspectives, and in many times, of course, crossing the boundaries of the two. And of course, nobody here is a prophet, nobody here has a crystal ball, but what we can do is we can look at the situation of the world today, and based on that situation, we can try to extrapolate and make predictions and have a certain developed sensibility to what could be happening in the next decades and what we could be doing in order to make sure that we alleviate three levels of suffering. That's really the main concern of this conference. The first level of suffering, of course, is at the human level, right? So what can we do as individuals, as communities, as larger groups, as organizations, foundations, to decrease the level of human suffering in the world? What about animal suffering as the second level? So we humans have perpetrated horrendous levels of suffering to fellow animals, and I think there is a raising awareness that the situation, to a certain extent, is not really sustainable. We talked yesterday evening with Peter Singer, who joined us from Australia, and I was telling him that the biggest meatpacking, industrializing, and distribution company in the world is actually a Brazilian company called JBS. And I just gave a few numbers to give people some order of magnitude of what goes on daily, just with this particular company. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. So every day you have the killing of 12 million birds, 85,000 heads of cattle, 70,000 pigs, and that kind of meat is distributed over 150 countries. So that is one company. It is the biggest company, but it's followed very closely with the American company called Tyson Foods. So that is the level of genocide, really, that is being perpetrated to animals. So the question of animal rights and animal suffering is also very much part of our conversation. And finally, we talk about planetary suffering, the level of environmental degradation that we have been perpetrating in this planet, our home planet, for pretty much since we've been around, but clearly much more violently for the last 200, 300 years with the development of industrialization and mass production and giant industrial farming facilities across the planet, right? And what are the consequences of these activities? So just to give you a quick rundown, yesterday we had opening at the conference, we had Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was talking to us about her own concerns of population growth and climate change, of course, but also the kind of rise of the woke movement, the notion that there are people that absolutely know what is right and what is wrong, and even though they are in the side of, let's say, freedom rights, etc., one has to be very careful about dogmatic control. So we should talk a little bit about that, the notion of going after the demolition of the established order and cancel culture, going against cancel culture. All these things tend to be valid, but have to be done very carefully and perhaps not so one-sided, so that we talked about the notion that if you're fighting oppression as an oppressor, then you're being a little paradoxical in your attitude. Then we had Sul Halpern, who's an expert on the impact of technologies in our lives, right? And in particular, the surveillance technologies, the fact that our digital identities are essentially being stolen by big companies, our data is being sold. To what extent is this something that we want to happen to you? To what extent it is not? And she also mentioned her worries about artificial intelligence, and saying, quite correctly, in my opinion, that you should put the emphasis not in intelligence, but in artificial, right? And because it is artificial, there are all sorts of problems, for example, face recognition software and other issues which are incapable of very, very low precision in identifying people of color, and all sorts of complications as it generates to the justice and criminal system, among other problems, right? And so this is some of the concerns that Sue raised. And then we had Terry Tempest Williams, who was speaking to us all the way from Moab in Utah, amidst a raging fire that is really devastating the area over there. And she was really concerned. And in fact, even her connection was not very solid. You could see her fading away, but she gave us a beautiful, very eloquent, very emotional testimony of what's going on in that part of the land that we don't even know about, connecting, of course, with the notion of how we decoupled from nature. And because of that, we have been treating nature as a commodity. And these are the main concerns that we have, when we talk about questions of raging fires in the American Southwest, the lack of water, and the distancing from the normal cultural knowledge of the indigenous peoples that have lived there for a long, long time. And then we had Adam Frank. He talked about a work which is really a collaborative work between him, myself, and the philosopher Evan Thompson, who teaches at the University of British Columbia in Canada, about the notion of the blind spot. And the blind spot here being essentially the fact that as we practice science, we sort of believe in a somewhat naive philosophical sense in this notion of absolute objectivity, and we forget about the role of experience in our narrative, in our scientific narrative, human experience, and that everything really comes from this human experience, and everything should not be neglecting that, and how this neglect has given us some of the more complicated issues that we deal with science that has also repercussions for the planet as a whole. Then we had Bill McKibben, one of the great pioneers of the awareness of global warming. He gave us a wonderful summary of the current situation, the current dangers, the potential irreversibility of what's already going on. I suspect Martin, our next speaker, will be touching upon these things in his and he also said that the problem, and I'm going to quote, is that money is the oxygen in which the fires of global warming burn. So it is really through that kind of approach that you may be able to make a difference, stopping or slowing down or reversing some of the practices that we have. He said, we just have to stop burning things. And I thought that was a very good way of thinking about how it is that we get energy from nature. And the closing talk was by Peter Singer. He, of course, talked about animal rights, given that he was one of the great pioneers of animal rights. And he also talked about the importance of effective altruism, which is the notion that if you are going to be giving, philanthropically to an organization, to a group, you have to think of how you can optimize to the maximum the impact of your giving, right? So the effectiveness of your altruism is extremely important. He talked about a little bit, and we also, of course, talked about the cruelty towards animals, and I mentioned a quote from Isaac Bashevis Singer, who says that to animals, every day is Treblinka, right? And I gave you numbers that make Treblinka kind of shrink in terms of at least the raw numbers of what goes on. And so today we are going to move to a different set of speakers, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker in 1 second. But before we do that, I wanted to play a 90-second long video, which explains a little bit what the mission of this institute has been in the last 5 years. So please, Dan, go ahead.
The world is a complex place, a network of flowing information and changing patterns, where forces known and unknown generate the most sublime beauty and the most terrifying destruction. The world inspires wonder and doubt, and we humans try to make sense of it all, creating stories, theories, symphonies, and poems. I am Marcelo Gleiser, Director of the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth, or ICE. On behalf of all of us at ICE and our partners, I invite you to be a part of our institute, to be a part of this very essential conversation. What is the nature of reality? What is the future of humanity? Will machines think? Will and should we become immortal? Is there free will? Are we alone in the universe? Can science be a path towards spirituality? ICE was created to address these issues and establish new bridges between different ways of knowing. Our mission is to overcome old bigotries and facilitate a constructive dialogue between intellectuals and the general public, creating a community of citizens concerned with the common good, engaging experts, promoting public dialogue, and offering open access courses. One thing is certain: the hardest questions ask for different viewpoints, for a cross-disciplinary approach, for intellectual openness. The sciences and the humanities need one another now more than ever, and we need them both.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So now it is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you our next speaker, the one who is opening this conference this morning. Sir Martin Rees, also Lord Rees of Ludlow, is for sure one of the world's most renowned and respected astrophysicists and cosmologists. He is the Astronomer Royal of the United Kingdom. He is a professor at the University of Cambridge. He's been director of the Institute for Astronomy there. He is a fellow and he's a former master of Trinity College in Cambridge, which, if you do not know, is also the college that Newton used to be for a while when he was there. He's been president of the Royal Society from 2005 to 2010. His work has included galaxy formation, cosmic jets, black holes, gamma ray bursts, and also more speculative aspects of cosmology, including the possibility of whether we live or not in a multiverse. And he's also very interested in the prospects of detecting extraterrestrial life, right? And more recently, as you may have known from his popular books, he's been very, very interested in existential risks for the future of humanity, which is one of the reasons why he's here in this conference, apart from the fact that it's always a great pleasure and privilege to listen to Martin and his ideas. Let me just mention that he is a foreign member of pretty much all the important national academies you can think of, including the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has absolutely a curriculum that I will not go on for, because then we won't be able to listen to him. And let me just mention a couple of prizes he's won. One is the Cosmology Prize from the Peter Gruber Foundation, the Einstein Award of the World Cultural Council, and the Templeton Prize, and also the Dirac Prize. And he's authored more than 500 publications. And let me mention some of his books. I think there are about 10 of them right now. They include Just Six Numbers, Our Cosmic Habitat, Gravity's Fatal Attraction, and the recently published and very, very apropos of our conference on the future prospects for humanity. So, Martin, please join me on our virtual stage.
Well, I'd first like to thank Professor Gleiser for inviting me to this meeting. It's a great pleasure to be here. Sorry, it's only in 2D and not for real. Because I have the title Astronomer Royal, I'm sometimes asked, do you do the Queen's horoscopes? But I'm just an astronomer, not an astrologer, and scientists are rotten forecasters, almost as bad as economists. But I've nonetheless written a book entitled On the Future. But my forecasts are going to be very tentative, especially in front of an audience where there are people with far more expertise than me. And my theme is this: this century is special. The Earth existed for 4.5 billion years, but this is the first century where one species, ours, has the world's future in its hands. We're deep in the Anthropocene. But let's first focus on two things that we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball. First, the world in 2050 will be more crowded. 50 years ago, the world population was below 4 billion. It's now about 7.8 billion, and the growth's been mainly in Asia and Africa. And this distorted map gives each country a size proportional to the growth in its population in the last 30 years. And you can see the growth being mainly in Asia and Africa. The number of births per year worldwide is now going down in most countries. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. And that's mainly because most people in the developing world are young and they'll live longer. The age histogram in the developing world is like on the left, and that will become more like the one on the right as it is in Europe. More old people relative to young ones. But despite doom-laden forecasts from the Club of Rome and others around 1970, food production has kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion in 2050 will require further improved agriculture, low-till, water conserving, and GM crops. And maybe some dietary innovations, converting insects and maggots, highly nutritious and rich in protein, into palatable food, and making artificial meat. To quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population projections beyond 2050 are uncertain. Falling infant mortality, urbanization, and women's education trigger the demographic transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be countervailing cultural influences. So if, for whatever reason, families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN, that continent's population could double again by 2100 to 4 billion, thereby raising the world's population to 11 billion. And Nigeria alone would by then have almost as big a population as Western Europe and the US combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses and the great inequalities which are most worrying. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know via the internet, etc., what they're missing, and migration is easier. So wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently instigate a mega Marshall Plan, as it were, for Africa, and do this not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already, there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being, but the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right. And to quote E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard ecologist, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And the second firm prediction, it's getting warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, though it is still under-responded to. The famous Keeling curve shows how the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen over the last 60 years, mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels. The seasonal oscillation, incidentally, is because there's more vegetation in the northern hemisphere than the south. So when the leaves fall off the tree in the northern fall, then it goes up and then down in the spring. But the key thing is the upward trend. And the fifth IPCC report presented a spread of projections for the global temperature rise for different assumptions about future rates of fossil fuel use and associated rises in the CO2 concentration. It's still unclear, incidentally, how much the direct climatic effects of CO2 greenhouse effects are amplified by associated changes in water vapor and cloud cover. That's a further uncertainty. That's indicated by the bars on the right for each of the four scenarios. But despite the uncertainties, there's one message that most would agree on. It's that under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends, like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. Politicians do focus on immediate threats, like COVID-19, but they won't prioritize the global and long-term measures needed to deal with climate change and biodiversity, because their worst impact stretches far beyond the time horizon of political decisions and normal investment decisions. But we're like the proverbial boiling frog, contented in a warming tank until it's too late to save itself. And of course, it's nations far away from ours which will suffer most from climate change. Unsurprisingly, it's the young who expect to live to the end of the century, whose clamour for action is loudest. Their leverage on voters and the media is important, and politicians will act if they think voters are behind them. And this voice is amplified by charismatic individuals, especially at the moment the rather disparate quartet of Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. And there are crucial meetings this year in Glasgow on climate and in Kunming in China on biodiversity. So let's hope something is agreed there. But to insert a bit of good cheer, there's a win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Nations should accelerate research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy generation and into other technologies where parallel progress is crucial, especially storage, batteries, compressed air, hydrogen, etc., and also smart transcontinental grids. This should enable Europe and North America to reach net zero by 2050. But there's something even more important. The faster these clean energy technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable by poor nations in the global south. These nations can't reach acceptable living standards without generating more power than they do today. Not only will their per capita energy needs rise, unlike ours, but they will collectively harbor 1 billion more people by 2050. So bending the trajectory of CO2 emissions from these countries is crucial. They must be enabled to leapfrog more speedily to clean energy, rather than building coal-fired power stations, just as they've leapfrogged directly to smartphones without ever having landlines. And it would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy systems that can achieve net zero for the entire world. We should be evangelists for new technology. Without it, the world can't provide food and sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. Indeed, many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and that we therefore have a bumpy ride through this century. Nuclear war still looms over us. The only consolation is that there are about 5 times fewer weapons and on lower alert than the US and Russia deployed during the Cold War. But there are now 9 nuclear powers, and a higher chance than ever before that smaller nuclear arsenals might be used regionally, or even by terrorists. And some claim that command and control systems are getting more vulnerable to cyber threats. Moreover, we can't rule out later this century a standoff between new superpowers that could be handled less well or less luckily than the Cuba crisis was. Nuclear weapons are 20th century technology, but this century has brought surges in new technologies, bio, cyber, and AI. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing natural pandemics, as we're seeing now with COVID-19. But the same research raises, and this is my number one nightmare, the prospect of engineered pandemics. This is the influenza virus. And in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make this virus both more virulent and more transmissible. For some, this was a scary portent of things to come, because these so-called gain-of-function experiments can be done in principle for coronaviruses as well. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising. But there are ethical concerns about experiments on human embryos, for instance. And there are also worries about possible runaway consequences of gene drive programs, which are used to wipe out species by making them sterile. Species as diverse as mosquitoes, which carry dangerous viruses, or grey squirrels, which are rather nice animals in Britain, but they are outcompeting the preferred ground squirrels. So regulation of biotech is needed. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare, because whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, by biotech and by cybertech as well, will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between 3 things we want to preserve: freedom, privacy, and security. The global village will have its village idiots, but their idiocies can now cascade globally. These concerns are fairly near term, within the next 10 or 15 years. But what about 2050 and beyond? On the bio front, we might then expect 2 things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes that determine key human characteristics. And second, the ability to synthesize genomes that match these features. And if biohackers can really, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. And what about another transformational technology, robotics and AI? Famously, DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer beat human champions in the games of Go and chess. It was given just the rules and trained by playing millions of games within a few hours. And this gentleman is the human champion who's just been beaten by the computer. His name's Lo Kui. But he has some advantages. The computer needed hundreds of kilowatts of power, but he uses about 30 watts, no more than a light bulb. And his brain could do lots of other things apart from playing a game. Already, AI, because of its ever-rising processing speed, indicated on this famous diagram, can cope better than humans with data-rich, fast-changing networks. Traffic flows, for instance, or electric grids. And the Chinese could have an efficient, planned economy that Marx could only dream of. And it can help science too, computing protein folding, drug development, and perhaps even settling whether string theory can really describe our universe. But the implications of machine learning for our society are already ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If these decisions were entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines made better decisions than the humans they've usurped. AI systems will become more intrusive and pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health, and our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used benignly, for medical research, for instance, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. The incipient shifts in the nature of work due to AI have been addressed in several excellent books by economists and social scientists. Clearly, machines will take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution, and they can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. In contrast, some skilled service sector jobs, plumbing and gardening, for instance, require non-routine interactions with the external world, and they'd be about the hardest jobs to automate. The digital revolution generates huge wealth for innovators and global companies, but preserving a healthy society will surely require redistribution of that wealth. Indeed, to create a humane society, governments will need to use that wealth to vastly enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick. There are currently far too few of them, and they're poorly paid in most countries, inadequately esteemed and insecure. But those jobs are far more fulfilling than the jobs in call centers or Amazon warehouses. So if AI usurps those jobs and they're replaced by caring jobs, that's a win-win situation. It's of course the speed of computers which allows them to learn on big training sets. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual tests. In Europe, they're given European Union documents. Their boredom threshold is infinite. But acquiring common sense won't be so easy for them, because that involves observing actual people in real homes or workplaces. And a machine would be sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. For it, it's like watching trees grow is for us, and it can't learn enough fast enough. And robots are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard, and they can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel, but sensor technology is advancing apace. And this leads to a digression. It's always harder to forecast the speed of technical changes than their direction. Sometimes there's a spell of exponential progress, like the spread of IT and smartphones in the last decade or two, but then there's an inflection or even stagnation. Let me give two examples. From Alcock and Brown's first transatlantic flight in 1919 to the first jumbo jet in 1969, was 50 years. But 50 years later, we still have the jumbo jet, and Concorde came and went. And it was only 12 years from Sputnik 1 in 1957 to the moon landings. But 50 years later than that, Apollo is still a high point of human spaceflight. And experts are getting less optimistic about how quickly stage 5 fully driverless cars will become acceptable. And the iPhone 20 may be not too different from the iPhone 12. But let's look still further ahead. What if a machine developed a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? Some futuristic books portray a dark side, where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the Internet of Things, and pursues goals misaligned with human interests. Some AI pundits take this seriously. Others, like, for instance, Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robot, regard these concerns as premature and think it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence will worry us more than real stupidity does. But be that as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities, and whether we should worry more about breakdowns and bugs or about being outsmarted. The visionary futurologist Ray Kurzweil argues in his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, and later books, that humans will transcend biology by merging their brains with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. We then confront the classic philosophical problem of personal identity. Could your brain be downloaded into a machine? If so, in what sense would it still be you? Should you be relaxed about your original body then being destroyed? What would happen if several clones were made of you? These are ancient conundrums for philosophers, but practical ethicists may one distant day need to address them. But Kurzweil is worried that his nirvana may not happen in his lifetime, so he wants to be preserved until it's reached. A company in Arizona will freeze and store your body, so that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. I was surprised to find that 3 academics in England had gone in for this cryonics. 2 have paid the full whack. The 3rd has taken the cut price option of wanting just his head frozen. I was glad they were all from Oxford and not from my university, because I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator. But of course, research on aging is being seriously prioritized. Will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension would plainly be a real wild card in population projections, with huge social ramifications. But it may happen along with human enhancements in other forms. Their mentality and their physique may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technologies. Designer babies may become conceivable in both senses of the word. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a real game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have some algorithmic understanding of how we behave. And now I turn to another technology, space, because it's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborg and AI technology can have the most spectacular scope, where these changes may happen fastest and should worry us less. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes. far more advanced than the wonderful Cassini, designed in the 1990s, which spent 13 years exploring Saturn and its moons, or the New Horizon probe, which transmitted back to us amazing pictures from Pluto, 12,000 times further away than the moon. Think back to the computers and phones of the 1990s, when these probes were designed, and realize how much better we can do today. And the next step will be deployment in space of robotic fabricators. We can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes or solar energy collectors assembled under zero gravity. But what about human spaceflight? Here, the practical case gets ever weaker with each advance in robots and miniaturization. So, will it have a resurgence? I cherish this picture, which was signed for me by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. And it's nearly 50 years since Harrison Schmitt and Ed Kernan made their return from the last voyage to the moon. Hundreds more have ventured into space subsequently, but anticlimactically, they've done no more than circle the Earth in low orbit, mostly in the International Space Station. And this only makes news when something goes wrong, when the toilet fails, for instance, or when they perform stunts, like the Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield playing his guitar and singing David Bowie songs. So will there be ever any inspirational Apollo-style projects? There's no denying that NASA's Perseverance, now starting to crawl around on the Martian surface, may miss startling discoveries that no human geologist could overlook. But machine learning is advancing fast, as is sensor technology. In contrast, the cost gap between human and robotic missions remains huge. NASA's manned program ever since Apollo has been impeded by public and political pressure into being extremely risk-averse. The space shuttle failed twice in 135 launches. Astronauts or test pilots would willingly accept this 2% level of risk, but the shuttle had unwisely been promoted as being safe for civilians. And because of this safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goal within a feasible budget. And if I were an American, I would strongly support NASA's robotic programs, but I'd argue that all human missions should be private enterprise ventures. Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin could operate a cut-price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians, and therefore much cheaper. And there'd still be many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And by 2100, some courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent of the Earth, probably on Mars. And Elon Musk himself says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he's only about 50 now, so he may make that in 40 years' time. But don't ever expect mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic, the top of Everest, or the ocean bed. And here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous illusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change is hard, but it's a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these brave space adventurers, because they will have a pivotal role in spearheading the post-human future in the 22nd century and far beyond. And this is why. They'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat, so they'll have a more compelling incentive than those of us on Earth to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that will be developed in coming decades. These techniques will, one hopes, be restrained here on Earth on prudential and ethical grounds. But these settlers on Mars will be beyond the clutches of the regulators, and we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to alien environments. So these spacefaring pioneers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead the post-human era that Kurzweil envisages. I'm often asked, do astronomers bring a special perspective to global issues? Let me explain why I think they do. We're all familiar with this time chart of Darwinian evolution over the last 4 billion years or so. But many people who accept all this somehow think we humans are the culmination, the top of the tree. But no astronomer could believe this, because the sun is less than halfway through its life. It's got 6 billion years before it dies. And the cosmos may have an infinite time ahead. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may be nearer the beginning than the culmination of the emergence of ever greater complexity in the cosmos. What about brains? Human brains have changed little since our ancestors roamed the African savannah. And it's sure remarkable that these brains have allowed us to make sense of the quantum and the cosmos, far removed from the common sense everyday world in which we evolved. Nonetheless, some key features of reality may be beyond our conceptual grasp. There may be phenomena crucial to our long-term destiny that we are not aware of, any more than a monkey comprehends the nature of stars and galaxies. I think it's likely that the machines will take over. This is because there are chemical and metabolic limits to the size and processing power of wet organic brains. Maybe we humans are close to that already. So, by any definition of thinking, the amount and intensity that's done by organic human-type brains may in the long run be utterly swamped by the cerebrations of AI. Moreover, the Earth's biosphere is far from optimal for AI. Interplanetary and interstellar space may be the preferred arena, where robotic fabricators will have the grander scope for construction and where non-biological brains may develop insights far beyond our imaginings. But we humans, despite these scenarios, shouldn't feel too humbled. Even though we are surely not the terminal branch of an evolutionary tree, we could be of special cosmic significance for jump-starting the transition to electronic and potentially immortal entities, spreading their influence far beyond the Earth and far transcending our limitations. Some people may now want to ask the question that astronomers most often get: is there life out there already? Or is the galaxy waiting for our remote progeny? That's, I think, about the most fascinating question in astronomy, indeed in science. But it is a topic for a different lecture, or maybe for the question period after this one. But even in the context of the concertina timeline I showed, extending billions of years into the future, as well as into the past, this century is special. It's the first when one species, ours, has the future in its hands. Our creative intelligence could jumpstart the transition from an Earth-based to a spacefaring species, and from biological to electronic intelligence. Transitions that could inaugurate billions of years of post-human evolution, even more marvelous than what's led to us. On the other hand, humans could trigger bio, cyber, or environmental catastrophes this century that foreclose all such potentialities. So what should be our message to the younger generation who will live through this crucial century? Crucial even in this perspective of billions of future years and billions of past years. The message is surely that there's no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable world where all enjoy a lifestyle better than those in the West do today. We live under the shadow of new hazards, but these can be minimized by a culture of responsible innovation, especially in fields like biotech, advanced AI, and maybe geoengineering, and by reprioritizing the thrust of the world's technological efforts so we can take maximum advantage of the benefits and minimize the downsides. So we can be technological optimists, but the intractable politics and sociology engender pessimism. The scenarios I've described, environmental degradation, unchecked climate change, and unintended consequences of advanced technology, could trigger serious, even catastrophic setbacks to our society. And our world is so interconnected that the collapse, societal or ecological, would be a truly global setback. We'll surely have a bumpy ride through this century, but we must survive it. Given the stakes, these threats shouldn't be ignored. We should be mindful of Nate Silver's maxim, the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And scientists in particular have an obligation to promote benign applications of their work and warn against the downsides. Universities should offer their staff's expertise and use their convening power to assess which scary scenarios, be they echo threats or risk for misapplied technology, can be dismissed as science fiction, and how best to avoid the ones that are serious. And we at Cambridge University have in fact set up a centre to address just these kinds of threats. And most of the challenges are global. Coping with COVID-19 plainly is, and the threats of potential shortages of food, water and natural resources, and transitioning to low carbon energy, they can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations, especially those spearheaded by globe-spanning commercial conglomerates. Indeed, it's a key issue whether, in a new world order, nations need to give up more sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, etc., to deal with these other challenges. And let me end with a flashback, right back to the Middle Ages. This is Ely Cathedral, about 10 miles from where I live in Cambridge. For medieval people, the entire cosmology, from creation to apocalypse, spanned only a few thousand years. Large parts of the world were terra incognita. But they built huge cathedrals, constructed with primitive technology by masons who knew they wouldn't live to see them finished. Glorious buildings like this one, which still inspire us many centuries later. Our horizons in space and time are now vastly extended, but we don't plan centuries ahead. This at first sight seems a paradox, but there is a reason. Medieval lives played out against a backdrop that changed little from one generation to the next. The masons were confident that they'd have grandchildren who'd appreciate the finished cathedral. But for us, unlike for them, the next 50 or 100 years will be drastically different than the present. We can't foresee what things will be like at the end of this century, so it's harder for us to plan for it. There's now a huge disjunction between the ever shorter timescales of social and technical change and the billion-year time spans of biology, geology, and cosmology. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruptions and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. This pale blue dot in the cosmos is a special place. It may be a unique place. And we are its stewards at a especially crucial era. That's an important message for us all. We need to think globally. We need to think rationally. We need to think long term. We need to be good ancestors, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think this was incredibly sobering and extremely essential to the conversation we should all be having nowadays within the universities and outside, really, in the world as a whole. And I knew it was going to be disturbing to listen to this, but also necessary. And I have a few comments that I annotated down here, but I would like to respect the public first and go to their questions. So let's go. We have one here that says, do you think that new technologies should be accompanied by a new arrangement in society? If yes, what are the main changes in this new arrangement? What would the main changes in this arrangement be?
Well, I think the main concern is that the present economic system is leading to much greater inequalities. And that's why we need some massive redistribution of wealth in order to ensure that those displaced by the technologies can survive, and therefore that those people have a bigger say in how priorities are set by governments. I think we need to learn more from Scandinavian countries than from countries like yours and mine in how society can be organized.
Yeah. Which means, I wrote something here that says that from what you're saying, the world is being really threatened globally, but it's so deeply fragmented geopolitically that it is incredibly difficult to foresee a mechanism that will actually be able to enact it.
It's a challenge, but of course, when we think of the situation in Africa, then if they get left behind, they'll be embittered at the great inequality and the injustice of their fates. And that's a recipe for a very turbulent world. So it's in our interests to ensure that there is not only greater equality within each country, but even more between the advantaged parts of the world, like our own countries, and the countries like Africa and the Middle East.
Absolutely. It's almost like a safeguard for our collective future.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I have a question here from Adam Frank, who is one of the speakers. He says, how probable is it, that's really going to be an opinion, I guess, that machines can become truly self-conscious as opposed to just philosophical zombies, i.e. highly adaptable, but with no interior experience, not really alive?
Yes. Well, I think that's a very important question. Some may say it's semantic, like asking, do submarines swim or something? But I think it's very important. And when I wrote an article on this topic and said the machines may take over, I got two contrasting responses from people, depending on what they thought about consciousness. Some said, well, isn't it great if these are superhuman brains, they think more deeply, they feel more deeply, etc. That's great. But on the other hand, some said, if these entities don't have self-awareness, don't have consciousness, isn't it a depressing scenario if there are no entities capable of appreciating the wonder and the mystery of the cosmos? So consciousness is something which is essential for that appreciation, and so it is important to know whether machines will have it. And of course, the view among experts is divided. There are some who think that electronic machines will never have consciousness, that is special to flesh and blood entities like us, whereas others think it's an emergent property which will emerge in an evolutionary way in any sufficiently complex structure.
Yeah, I wonder if this issue is somewhat related to the awareness of the passage of time, and to what extent a machine would have that awareness.
Yes, I don't know, but it can have all clocks built in, obviously, so it doesn't need awareness in that sense. But it is relevant to ask, would the machine get bored? And yes. We care if our colleagues get bored. We care even if animals don't fulfill their full potential. So the question is, should we start worrying if our computers are underemployed or bored? And that does depend on the answer to this deeper question.
Yes. Absolutely. And wow, this could be a conversation that will go on for a while but I'm going to hold myself back here. And there's a very interesting question here for you. Scientists working at for-profit institutions are playing key roles in developing new technology. What kinds of moral obligations and responsibilities should those scientists have?
Well, I think they have a obligation not to do anything which they think is manifestly damaging, to act as whistleblowers if they think work is being done in their company which is damaging, and to do all they can to ensure, conversely, that any discovery they make or involved in is maximally used for human benefit. So I think that they do have the same obligation, whether they're in a private company or working for the public.
Yes, but at some level, a lot of the technologies and machine learning and AI applications are really being programmed by technicians, by engineers and young scientists without a lot of ethical or philosophical training, right? And it worries people that could really spin out of control.
Well, I mean, I think that is a problem. And there's also a problem in that the multinational companies are, as you say, profit driven. And this sort of thing has happened with a company like DeepMind, which was an independent company in London. It's still based in London, but it's part of Google. And I think when it stopped being a star research group and became a money spinner, then of course the attitude of the parent company towards the ethics changes a bit.
Exactly. That's which is true also for global warming, as Bill McKibben was mentioning yesterday.
That's why, one of the many reasons why the public needs to have some understanding and some feeling for science, because politicians will respond to what voters in general think. And if voters themselves understand and care about these ethical issues, then politicians will respond and will control the companies as necessary. But if it's just a mystery, then the politicians will focus only on those which the voters clamor about and not about these more important issues.
That's an excellent point that kind of floated about a little bit yesterday in terms of, do you think we should be promoting a deep educational reform on how we talk about science and the humanities at all levels of education, not just at the university level, so that people have a different awareness of the complexity of these problems, as opposed to becoming very specialized, in a specific part of a small discipline.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think education at all levels is much too specialized. It's focused in stovepipes in school education, certainly in my country, and in universities too specialized as well. So I think it's very important that everyone gets a feel for science, to understand how the human body works, to understand the natural world, etc., and has enough feeling for numbers that they can't be easily bamboozled by false statistics. That's very important for everyone, especially as a bigger proportion of the issues which they have to address as voters have a scientific dimension, whether it be medicine, environment, or energy. So it's very important. But of course, scientists shouldn't moan too much. That scientists tend to moan that politicians aren't scientifically trained, etc. But it's just as bad if the public doesn't understand the history of their country and can't find South Korea or Iran on a map. And I think many adults in your country and mine can't do either of those things, and that is equally shameful. And incidentally, I don't think it's necessary that scientists should, that politicians should be professional scientists. Indeed, I said in different contexts that I'd rather that my prime minister had a PhD in history than in dentistry. Better training. We've got a present prime minister who's got neither, unfortunately. But I think a background in the humanities is as valuable in a politician, at least, as any scientific training. But all should have a basic understanding of science.
Absolutely. Martin, I would love to talk to you, keep going on, but I have to move on to our next speaker. And I'd like to, again, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, your wisdom. And I hope this will be the beginning of many other connections and conferences as we move forward.
Yes. Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation.
My pleasure.
Great to be watching this talk today.
Yeah, well, I hope you stay and watch other talks as well as we move on. Okay. Have a great day. Okay, everyone. So actually, this couldn't have been better planned because we talked about all these different scenarios, and now we go back to talk about us. The next presentation is by the world-renowned philosopher John Haldane, and he titled his presentation perfectly, Understanding Humans, a Fruitful Ambiguity. So let me tell you a little bit about Professor Haldane. He is the professor of moral philosophy, emeritus, and a senior fellow for the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at the University of St. Andrews. He's professor of virtue theory, the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. He is professor of philosophy of education, Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, and a distinguished affiliate professor of philosophy at Baylor University. As you can imagine, he's a very, very busy person. He's joined the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues in January 2021 as professor of virtue theory and works with the research team to guide the center's research in the areas of moral philosophy and virtue theory. He has held the chair in moral philosophy at the University of St. Andrews for the last 25 years, where he led the pioneering Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs for over 20 years and remains there as a senior fellow. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, was chair of the Council of the Royal Institute of Philosophy from 2010 to 2020, and has been awarded honorary degrees in many universities in Britain, the United States, and Australia. His work to date has focused upon central issues in the philosophy of mind, the history of philosophy, theoretical and normative issues in social and political philosophy, ethics and aesthetics, and artistic, educational, and theological issues. So, Professor Haldane, please join me in our virtual stage.
Thank you very much indeed. Good. Well, let me just say, I should explain to begin with that over the last half hour, I've had a slight sort of crisis as I wondered whether, in fact, I was going to be able to join you, because others may be in the same situation, not perhaps with regard to this conference, but more generally. My computer this morning told me that I should be upgrading to a new operating system, which I should have just ignored that, but I didn't. And it spent several hours failing to upgrade to that system. So I'm in fact not speaking to you on by the means that I had originally anticipated. But may I just check? I'm hoping that you can both see and hear me. Is that the case? Can somebody confirm that?
Yes, we can hear and see you very well. Thank you. Very relieved.
So, as I say, my mind has been sort of drawn down from lofty matters to rather practical ones in trying to make sure I could get a computer to work. At any rate, but it does, and so, or at least the one that I have now, is substituting. So let's just get underway. So let me begin first of all by thanking you, Marcelo, and your colleagues for first of all for conceiving and arranging this conference, and secondly gathering such an interesting group of people, and thirdly for including me among your presenters. Let me say a couple of reasons why I sort of greatly appreciate what you're doing at Dartmouth in your center. I think that there is a great need for a cross-disciplinary and relatedly, I suppose we might say, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, though those are not all exactly the same thing. But at any rate, a great need for cross-disciplinary study and investigation, in part for the reason that was discussed early on about the divide between these two ways of investigating aspects of reality and human beings' place within it. But I think that has become more pressing because of a feature that originates actually in science, but which is now spread across to taken its root within the humanities and indeed within the arts, and that is hyper-specialization. And this is in some respects an inevitable result of a progressive field of inquiry. Now, let me say what I mean by progressive field of inquiry here. I'm not referring to ethically or politically progressive or culturally progressive and so on. What I mean simply is this, that a field of inquiry whose business is the acquisition of knowledge will, as in the form of a tree, and this is where the notion of ramification comes from, will spread, and then the limbs will themselves give birth to, as well, further limbs, and you will get the situation in which, at the advancing limit of this body of knowledge, parts are very far removed from one another. And so it may be that in the context of the sciences, particularly the theoretical sciences, that practitioners across a range of fields that were once quite closely connected that now stand at some distance, and the only thing that they really may have in common was their undergraduate reading lists. Now, within the sciences, I think that this tendency of ramification and associated with the specialization is, first of all, to be expected, and secondly, is necessary if there is to be a real advance, because in the nature of things, matters have to be, large questions have to be broken down into smaller questions, and large methods have to be divided into smaller methods, and so on, if results are to be achieved. And it's by that method, or in that way, that great results have been achieved, but at a certain cost. So the divide isn't just, as say C.P. Snow was concerned with it, between, say, the sciences and the humanities. There are divides now within the humanities and within the sciences. As I say, they're within the humanities because the humanities have appropriated this conception, or at least many of them have, particularly, I think, beginning in North America, have appropriated this conception of academic inquiry that has its roots in science. And I want to say something about this and whether or not this model for inquiry in the case of the humanities is appropriate. I think it certainly is appropriate in the case of the sciences, but whether it's appropriate in the case of the humanities is itself a matter that I think we need to discuss. But as I say, even within the sciences, specialization, that hyper-specialization, has come to a point, brought people to a point, where there's very little in the way of common knowledge, even across fields of study like biology, for example. Now, why should I say that this is more problematic in the humanities and inappropriate in the humanities? Well, one way of approaching that would just be for me to recount something that will perhaps come as a surprise to some of our viewers, and perhaps even some of those who are participating more directly in this conference. Two of the great writings in the 19th century on the function and nature of universities, which were written in a period of great cultural and intellectual change and development, were Newman's idea of a university and John Stuart Mill's address to the students here in St Andrews, actually, on the occasion of his election by the students as rector of the university. On that occasion, he spoke for over 3 hours. Newman gave the lectures that became the idea of a university, originally in Dublin, but then published them as independent articles, and then they were brought together as a book. Now, the interesting thing about these two contributions, John Henry Newman, John Stuart Mill, great intellects of the 19th century, people of broad knowledge and depth of knowledge also, when they considered the question, which was their question, what ought to be taught in universities, they considered in answering that, what ought not to be taught in universities. And John Stuart Mill said that one of the things that ought not to go on in universities is professional training, vocational education, if you like, training in the professions. And in this, he had in mind things like engineering, law, medicine, and so on. It wasn't his view that there shouldn't be training of that sort, but that it wasn't the primary business of the universities to provide it. John Henry Newman, when he considered the question, what are universities for? Again, like Mill, he thought about what they should not be doing, or at least what in his view they should not be doing. And his answer to that question, what ought they not to be doing, which perhaps some people were then suggesting they should be doing, was research. And this is very striking because we now associate research so much with universities, and a great deal, of course, of the prestige for academics and institutions is associated with research. So why was it that Mill didn't want professional training, and why was it that Newman didn't want research to be going on in universities? Again, like Mill, Newman wasn't for a moment suggesting that there shouldn't be research. He thought there should be research institutes. He thought that perhaps they should even be adjacent to, proximate to universities. But he didn't think it was the business of universities themselves to engage in research. Now, these perhaps to us surprising and certainly very much at odds with the way universities, colleges and universities have gone, these views were expressions of something positive, which was a conception of the purpose of universities, which was, as they saw it, primarily educational, to introduce what, in the words of another 19th century figure, as he had expressed it, the best that has been thought and said, and to do so to a rising generation. So the point of education, as Mill and Newman and some other figures of the 19th century in Germany also, the way in which they conceived the function of education was that it was to produce understanding, not to acquire new knowledge, not to add to the sum of human knowledge, not to develop people for practical skills, but to bring people through the acquisition of certain disciplines and the immersion in great works to the practice of the search for understanding. Now, I think this is very important because both Mill and Newman were essentially humanists. That's to say, their intellectual traditions within which they worked were not scientific ones. They were those of the humanities. And that leads me really to consider this question. What might we think as being the difference between the sciences and the humanities? If we're concerned that there may be a gap between them, that this gap may be problematic, what is the nature of that gap? And how does it arise from a conception of these two fields, broad fields of inquiry, or sets of inquiries? Well, there are different ways of trying to identify activities. One is by the kind of objects that they study. Another is by their methods. Another might be by the sort of texts that they're canonical for them, that are the sort of foundational texts for them. But I think that so far as this issue is concerned, the best way of trying to get a grip on this is to ask the question, what is the place of explanation and understanding, and what is the nature of explanation and understanding, as these are sought for by the sciences and sought for by the humanities? And I think here there is a difference. I think that the sciences very broadly seek to acquire knowledge about the nature of reality, where the conception of how that knowledge will develop is by identifying, very broadly speaking, certain elements that are partly constitutive of the thing under study and the modes of combination of those elements. So the sciences, very broadly speaking, are engaged in certain causal inquiries. They're not just causal inquiries, but that's at their heart. What a scientist wants to know, as it were, is where he or she is concerned with some phenomenon, is obviously what's going on here. But in answering that question, what's going on here, what are the operative components and how are they interacting, such that those elements, together with those modes of combination, produce this kind of phenomenon. And then on the basis of that, you might predict how similar or related elements and modes of combination would produce similar effects. And you might also then apply these to practical questions, and so we get technology. In the case of the humanities, however, the kind of explanations that I think are sought for, or at least traditionally have been sought for, is a kind of intelligibility. That's to say, what the historian, for example, wants to do, what the philosopher wants to do, what the literary theorist wants to do, what the student of literature wants to do, is get a certain kind of understanding that isn't so much looking at causal operations as looking at meanings or significances or senses. That's to say, it's essentially interpretative. And in this sense, I think we might say, surprising as it sounds, perhaps flattering to science, perhaps disconcerting for the humanities, that the sciences genuinely add to the sum of human knowledge. That is to say, that they enlarge our understanding of the various elements. I'm using elements here in a very broad sense, the various elements and the modes of their combination as those feature at different levels of organization of matter, broadly speaking. Whereas the humanities are concerned to try to interpret certain phenomena, and in that interpretation come to some understanding of their significance. Well, if you're going to be engaged into interpretation, seeking meaning or significance, the kind of thing that you're going to be studying are things that are either literally texts or analogous to texts. And what those are essentially products of the human mind. And I think that the humanities, one way of thinking about the humanities, is that they are different modes of reflection, self-reflection, on the nature of what it is to be human. And this, by the way, I think explains why it is that it would really be a quite antiquarian interest to be looking at 19th century or 18th century astronomical works or works of physics or chemistry for a practicing contemporary astronomer or physicist or chemist to be doing that would be essentially a kind of curiosity or an antiquarian interest. Because the acquisition of knowledge in these fields is essentially developmental. That is to say, we just know more and more. We eliminate some things, we revisit some possibilities, but essentially it's, and this is what I meant when I said progressive, it's progressive and it's developmental. It would, however, be crazy in the case of the humanities to say something like, well, look, the latest is the best. And so if you want to read good literature, it would be mad to look at literature from the 18th century or the 17th century, let alone from the Middle Ages or from classical antiquity. Why would that be mad? Well, because the authors of the ancient world and the medieval world and of the Enlightenment period and of the present day are essentially engaged in the same study. And the study is that of what it is to be human, and understanding in that respect. Both as well the modes of human consciousness, the modes of human experience, and the modes of human intelligent productivity, the things that we make, and the way in which these are expressive of aspects of our nature, often in ways that we don't ourselves necessarily conceive of, and that is why these disciplines have developed to engage those questions. So what I'm saying then is this, that the need for cultural cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary studies is greater than ever, in part because of the problem of ramification and hyperspecialization, or what I say, the fact of ramification and hyperspecialization that pushes elements of sciences and now of humanities further apart, both within themselves and from one another. That's one reason. But the other reason to be concerned with these matters is that the sciences are, very broadly speaking, engaged in a different kind of inquiry to the inquiry that the humanities are concerned with. The humanities, very broadly speaking, are reflexive inquiries whose object is aspects of human nature, not physiological aspects of human nature, not the material aspects of human nature in terms of our composition, but well, the products of human consciousness, human thought, human agency, human purpose, human value, and so on, as these are ongoing, or as these are embodied and expressed in certain kinds of cultural and social institutions, in artworks, and in other forms of human productivity. Now, with that as background, let me just turn to some points raised in the conference thus far. And I want to draw, well, first of all, perhaps to remind those who've been with us through the conference thus far, remind them of some of the issues that have been raised and some of the points that have been made. But they will also provide an agenda that for me to give some thought to. Now, I'm not going to be able to discuss all of them for reasons of time. But let me just briefly begin with your own, your introduction yesterday. You raised a number of questions for us to be considering and for the audience to be considering. One of it was this: what should we expect extrapolating from the present? Another, what can we do to effect change positively or negatively? A third, what kind of progress might we expect and hope for? And fourth, what are the prospects in three sort of areas concerning human beings, concerning animals, concerning the environment? Now, the question of what we should expect is a difficult one. And it's difficult in part because of human agency. That's to say, predicting the future is harder, or certainly different, when it comes to predicting the human future in terms of human activity than it is, in a sense, in the kind of predictions that the scientists may be involved with. I mean, the scientists, of course, there can be unanticipated factors and so on, but increasingly science has a pretty good grip on the, again, I'll use this broad sense, broad use of the term elements, a pretty good grip on the range of elements that are in play in different domains at different levels, and the modes of their combination. Of course, there's much still to be understood, but very broadly speaking, the scientist is in pretty good position to tell us what would happen if such and such were to happen. However, where what we're dealing with is shaped in part by human agency, this is a harder thing to do, because of course human beings can reflect on what it is that they're doing, and they can change tack. They can, and this really brought us to that question you said, how can we affect change positively and negatively, or I'm adding positively and negatively? How can we make things happen, but how can we inhibit things happening? And also, why would we want to do so? Which brings in questions of purpose and value, to which I shall return. What kind of progress might we expect? Well, again, I'm now concerned with the human side of this, and that touches on a matter that was a theme for Peter Singer, which was to do in part to do with the expanding circle, but the question that you pressed upon him, which was what kind of ethical progress might we hope for or look for, certainly. Now, I just will touch on four of the presentations very briefly, beginning with Ayaan Hirsi Ali's, who, like me, really was speaking about the distinction between the sciences and the humanities. But she very quickly moved to considering what she thought was a threat to education, particularly, she had in mind, I think, undergraduate education, but no doubt beyond that also, which was the rise of certain kind of political ideology and its presence on campus, but not only there, in cultural institutions beyond colleges and universities, in broadcasting and media and so on. And she voiced very eloquently her concerns about that. And she thought, I think, in brief, that these involve certain simplifications and certain moralizations, which are at least premature for people who ought to be studying, because there's much to be learnt, as it were, before one can come to some well-conceived and deliberated view about how we ought to act. Now, Adam Frank spoke about the blind spot, and that could criticize certain kinds of reductionism. I'll say something briefly about that in a minute as well. And then Peter Singer, I'm not including everybody here again for reasons of time, but Peter Singer considered the prospect of annihilation and recalled a trio of scenarios proposed for consideration by the Oxford moral philosopher Derek Parfit, and one of which was, things go on as at present and everything is broadly speaking fine. If anything, it gets better. One was in which 90% of the world's population is annihilated, but 10% survive and build and reconstruct and expand in their numbers and so on. And the third in which there's total annihilation. And he recalled and endorsed, I think, Parfit's view that the greater difference was between the second and the third. That's to say, a situation in which the human population was annihilated was a much, much, much worse state of affairs than one in which even 90% was annihilated. Well, why is that? Well, because, and this is revealing, in a way that I think he would accept, revealing of Peter Singer's theory of value. His view, which he touched upon, is that what's of value are certain states of consciousness. What we might just very broadly speak of pleasure and pain. So pleasure has positive value, pain has negative value or disvalue. And so a scenario in which the entire human population was annihilated would be one in which the possibilities of positive value, at least so far as that population was concerned, was eliminated. And let's suppose that the event that annihilated us also annihilated other sentient beings, then all possibilities of value would be annihilated on that view. Now, I think that there's something to this clearly, but I think that it's likely to meet objection from two quarters. One is from those who think that states of pleasure are not the only kinds of things that are of value in human lives, and that there are many other kinds of things that are of value, and those might themselves be lost, but it's important to see they are different kinds of value. And the other concern or objection or question might be put, and perhaps you might have put it actually, because it touches on something you've spoken about and directed us towards, which is the concern of non-sentient environment. Isn't there, you might say, value inhering in nature, conceived of broadly speaking, quite apart from the value that attaches to the sensory states of sentient beings, such experiential states of sentient beings such as ourselves or animals? Now, for what it's worth, I actually am inclined here to agree with Peter Singer, at least so far as the implication concerns the environment. Because like Peter Singer, I think that our concern for the environment is and should be, for the greatest part, a concern for human existence. That's to say, the kind of ecological perspective that I favour, and I think Peter Singer favours, is broadly speaking a humanistic ecological perspective. Now, Peter Singer, of course, will add to that the perspective of other sentient beings. That was part of his expanded circle, and that's fine. We can add that in as well. But the point is, it's essentially the assessment of the value of policies bearing upon the state of the environment is considered in light of and by reference to its impact, or the impact of those policies on the lives of human beings and of other sentient beings. And that's in contrast to the deep ecologist who thinks that nature itself has a value quite independently of its being experienced or it being a locus for experiencing beings, for sentient beings. Now, I think that nature does have a value independently of its role in sustaining and providing experiences for human beings and other animals. But I do think that there's a hierarchy of value. And I do think that this brings us back to the question of humanity, because I think that so far as this world at any rate is concerned, that human beings do enjoy a special place. That's because I think there is a kind of ladder of being, and that sentient beings have powers and capacities that make certain sorts of things valuable and others disvaluable for them. And that we are like those and sharing in those values and disvalues, but that we have got something else that introduces a whole other realm of value. And what is that? Well, it's mind. And in particular, and this is slightly distinct from what Peter Singer has to say, it's not so much consciousness that is the distinguishing feature, though consciousness is central and necessary for what I'm about to mention. It's conceptuality. It's our capacity for understanding. And this brings me back to the humanities again, but also the sciences. The sciences seek a kind of understanding of the world, of human beings, but as human beings, along with other things, as part of the world, the cosmos in the larger sense. The humanities seek an understanding of human beings, because they are interested in these other things, but as mediated through human thought and reflection. And that thought and reflection, along with agency, is a manifestation of our capacity to form concepts and to understand things, not on the basis of how we experience them or how they feel, what they taste like, and so on, or at least not only that, but in terms of what they are, of their intrinsic nature, as it were. And this is, just as in science, there's a quest for the nature of things. So in the humanities, there's this quest for the understanding the nature of human beings, including human beings' capacity for understanding the natures of other things. And this is why I spoke of understanding humans a fruitful ambiguity, because there's the understanding humans, i.e. humans as being the objects of the search for understanding, but there's the fact that human beings are themselves understanding creatures. And so the practice of the humanities is reflexive in that way. It's understanding beings, understanding their own capacity for understanding, and seeing what the significance and meaning and value of that is. Now, if I have just a couple of minutes, I would like to turn finally and very briefly to something that makes a connection actually between the concerns of Ayaan Hirsi Ali that with which this conference began, and the video that you showed us in the course of yesterday of Mark O'Connell's talk in Boston, I think, around the issue of transhumanism. Now, time is short, so I will just be brief about this. It's interesting if you look at the origins of the concept of transhumanism, and of the term, let's just begin with that if we're dealing with the concept. It is actually quite recent, and it was first voiced, the term was coined by J.B.S. Haldane in Reflections, first of all in the 20s, and then which he revisited, I think in the 1950s. What he was concerned with, I think it was Kalinklos and the other one was Daedalus in these writings, actually just talks really. What he was concerned with was the capacity. Of course, he'd played a very important role in the systematization of genetic theory and understanding principles of heredity and so on. But what he was concerned with there was the recognition that in getting a grip on, a conceptual grip, and indeed, as it turned out later, literally a practical grip, on, as it were, the building blocks of life, it may be possible to modify these elements and the modes of their combination, back to where I began, really. And in that means to actually transform the nature of animate beings, of living things. And it perhaps wasn't didn't take a great deal of imagination to see that perhaps this could be applied to human beings themselves. But it is interesting, if you look at his reflections, how much he anticipated. But the significant thing, I mean, including what we would now call genetic engineering, but one of the most striking things is that he thought that these developments would take hundreds and probably thousands of years to occur. But look how rapidly matters have advanced. Now, I think that the transhumanist impulse is interesting. I have reservations about it, partly to do with the kinds of means and the consequences that might result in certain ways. But I have a more profound caution, let's move it that way, that's associated with the modes of thought that are to be found, on the one hand, among many transhumanists, the more ideologically driven transhumanists, but also among some of the ideologues that that Hursiali was concerned with in her presentation. And I would just end with this. I mean, there's much more that could be said about it, but I'll end with this. I'm a philosopher, but also I trained in the arts as well, but I'm a philosopher primarily. But the area of humanities that I think would be especially important for students to be introduced to is history. And the reason for that is that to try to overcome a certain tendency that's recurrent, it's the cultural or social equivalence of a kind of egoism, which is presentism, to think that the present moment is especially significant. Now, of course, it is important in many ways. I don't mean to deny that. But there is a kind of way of thinking, which I'll just call presentism, which I think overemphasizes the present moment and the events of the present moment, and which I think is a kind of vanity. And what's interesting, if we look historically, is to see the recurrence of the presentist tendency, but also along with it an over-dramatization. And I would just offer as something worth reflecting upon the very striking parallels there are between the present period and the kind of discourse of the present period and aspects of the period in which Europe was rebuilt, beginning in after the first 1,000 years of the Common Era. And if you look at the various movements from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and look at the present day, is to see a very interesting anti-humanist tendency. So, for example, I'll just mention a few of these. We had Catharism, which argued that people should not reproduce. Now we have antinatalism. We had Pelagianism, the idea that human beings could perfect themselves through their own efforts. Now we have transhumanism. We had Manichaeanism, which was a kind of dualism of a world of good and of evil. And you can see the Manichaeistic tendencies in partitioning the world into the good people and the bad people, the elect and the reprobate, as it were. There was antinomianism, which was a kind of moral exceptionalism, and you can see people who think that, as it were, their position and status elevates them, as it were, above other human beings often. You had iconoclasm, and we see now the destruction of images, whether it be statues, whether it be texts, whatever else it may be. And we have the looking forward to, in terms of religious ideas, say the resurrected body. In Paul, in his letter to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, it says, "You ask with what body shall we be raised? Do you not know what is sown in dishonor is raised in glory?" And he uses the phrase, the soma pneumatikon, the spiritualized body, a body that has overcome the limitations and contingencies of ordinary earthly bodies. Well, the aspiration to transcendence, often voiced in transhumanist contexts and others, and which drives certain kind of research programs, seems to me again to be a kind of recurrence of something that we find through history. But here I was just mentioning, say, Aquinas writing on Paul, writing on resurrection, but characterized the Middle Ages. And I will just finally mention, if I may, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that from the 11th through the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, Sweden produced, in each of those centuries, a very prominent young female, almost child saint. who called the world back from its disorder, prophesied a terrible future. And I'm struck that in our own times, something of that similar iconographical representation attaches to a young female environmentalist or environmental advocate from Sweden. So I draw to a close there. There are many matters, of course, to be discussed, but I hope at any rate to have introduced a certain kind of conceptual apparatus that might be helpful for thinking about the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, and in thinking about the future of humanity and making the case for the importance of the humanities as that place where human beings reflect most deeply upon themselves and upon their nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I think that was wonderful to bring this all together. And here I am, a theoretical physicist, pushing this. So you see that we're not all, blind at all to the absolute fundamental importance of the humanities in what we do. So there are lots of different questions. I have a few, but I'm going to, as I told Martin before, I'm going to respect the audience and start with some of their questions. Here I have one which is really kind of asking for clarification on what you mean by the division in the humanities being more problematic in a way than division in the sciences.
Well, because so go back to the metaphor of the tree of knowledge. I think that metaphor applies very well to the sciences, that as the inquiry into the nature, let's just simplify this by giving a single example, though it's a large example, the study of the nature of matter and the way in which that has developed. And, as you well know, I mean, the way in which we now think of the physical order is very different to the kind of corpuscularism that was thought of in one period, or the atomism of the Greek period, and so on. So what you have there is that there's this inquiry that builds and develops, and then it sort of goes into different branchings, and people look at, say, it may go, as it were, to the astronomical level. It might be looking at matter in its behavior in deep space and so on. It might be looking at finer and finer divisions of particles and such like. So what you get are these spreadings out. And as I say, you get specialization, and that's inevitable and necessary if you're really going to make progress. Humanities, however, have a slightly different concern. They have ultimately a single focus: the nature of human beings as that nature is revealed in experience, in action, in institutions, and in the products of these. So what the humanities should be seeking to do all the time, is to represent different inquiries as reflections on aspects of the same theme or the same subject, as it were. And the problem that's, to some extent, I think, overtaken the humanities is that in thinking of taking the model, the scientific model of inquiry, that has warranted and justified ramification, hyperspecialization, and so on. But in the case of the sciences, it really is justified by the nature of the inquiry and the necessary. He who wills the end wills the means. Well, if you really want to know the fine-grained detail of the universe, you're going to have to specialize, right?
Yeah.
If you want to know the nature of human beings, it's not clear that you have to specialize. Every tendency to specialize ought to be countered by pulling back and saying, okay, but so what you're saying here, how does that check with what historians are telling us? Or how does that check with what the Greek classics are telling us? What can we learn still from Herodotus? Because really we can learn something from Herodotus. Or what can we learn from Dante? Or what can we learn from David Hume in the 18th century? Or what can we learn from Mill in the 19th century about the human condition? Because they're all, again and again, asking the same questions, devising slightly different methods, but trying to come to answers about these. And that's why, great works in humanities don't age. That's why we can read them again, that they're ever fresh, because but ramification and specialization in the humanities risks destroying the nature of the subject. And by the way, I would just add a brief note there. I think that the appropriate term for what, say, you and your colleagues do when you're practicing as scientists is research.
Mhm.
I think the appropriate term for what people in the humanities are doing really ought to be scholarship rather than research.
Mhm.
And that's not to promote or to demote.
Mhm.
It's just to try to find another way of reminding ourselves of different kinds of concerns.
Mhm.
And that, by the way, speaks again to Mill and Newman in the 19th century. What they wanted to say is, no, the purpose of education is to cultivate in people, and then for those who have the means and the ability and the interest to continue with this, the project of understanding the human.
Yes.
And that is not acquiring new knowledge, it's understanding better what, in a sense, we already knew because it was given to us in experience. And this is where I think, that it was Adam Frank when he was talking about, it was about the importance of experience.
Mhm.
I think this is absolutely right, that the humanities are an investigation of what it is to be human, not in the anatomical sense, but in the experiential, agential, normative, evaluative sense. And that's why when you import into the humanities a certain model of inquiry that necessitates ramification and specialization, then you disintegrate the object of inquiry, you
Right.
fragment it. Whereas what a scholarly reflection ought to be doing is seeking ways to weave together.
Right.
That
Absolutely. No, that's good. Yeah, the notion of the blind spot is really that what it is to be human informs in an irreducible ways what it is to do science as a human.
absolutely, yes, exactly. Yeah.
In the sense that you really can't separate these things. And for those, let's say, scientists who are a little more humanists by nature, the notion of historical progress of knowledge is very important. You could reframe the question that you have asked. So if you go back to pre-Socratic Greece, Thales asked, "What is the world made of?" We're still asking the same question. We just don't know if it's dark matter, dark energy, but the question is evolving forward in a sense.
Absolutely. And one reason, this is one thing about why the history of the philosophy of science, as it were, as well as the history of science, is extremely interesting, because there's a sense in which Thales' answer was not a stupid one.
No.
When he said that everything was water, what he really was trying to say is this: there could be one kind of fundamental stuff, but distinguish that from its states. And of course, he would be familiar with three states, at least one, in terms of either direct experience or what had been reported to him: water as a solid, water as a liquid, water as a gas. Yeah. So his basic insight is not, in one sense, so remote from ideas that we might have today, which is that what we have to do is try to understand a single, as it were, underlying fundamental. Now, of course, we're more pluralistic about this, but of underlying fundamental, and then try to explain the variety, the experienced variety of the material order, not so much in terms of lots of different things, but of lots of different states or modifications of the underlying stuff. And that's why, speaking philosophically, as it were, it's not a waste of time to study the pre-Socratics.
No.
But of course, from my point of view, the kind of philosophy that really is what comes to life, and I'd say philosophy properness, well, I don't say philosophy proper, but let's just say centrally, it comes with Socrates, where his is the reflection on, as he sees it, a proper subject, as it were, which is humankind, human beings. What is it to be human, and what is it to live well? And what is it to live at one with the cosmos? And that connects these concerns with the environment and so on.
Absolutely. Yes. So we have a question here. Let's see. Do we have? Yes, we're almost out of time. So this, in fact, this will be the last question. It's a very good and difficult question, I guess, on the theory of virtue, perhaps. Do you think we can avoid vanity when striving for self-improvement and the betterment of humanity?
And the betterment of humanity. Yeah.
Yes.
I do think that one of the truths, I think we are caught, as it were, between two impulses. the aspiration to perfect ourselves and the tendency to despair at the impossibility of overcoming the mess that we make of things. And I think the truth about human beings lies somewhere between those. Of course, I don't want to despair at all. I think we have achieved things, we can continue to achieve things, but I do think it's very important to recognize contingency, vulnerability, and fallibility, and not to see these as merely temporary or local, I mean, cosmologically, as it were, local conditions that we can overcome, that it's just a matter of time before we overcome them. I think they're just aspects or features of the human condition. And so it is important, I think, to operate with humility. I sometimes use the expressions demeanor and decorum, which sound a bit like something that would be, taught in a finishing school. But what I have in mind by these is the way we carry ourselves in the world, in our inquiries, in our dealings personally with others, but also intellectually with others and so on, and politically as well, which, should be informed by the fact, and this is where history again is important, that human beings tend generally to mess up. Not always, not invariably, not necessarily, but that, small steps are more likely to get us to cover secure and solid ground to build than our efforts at great leaps, because those leaps often are ill-considered and overlook the uncertainties that inevitably attach to trying to build on new ground, as it were.
Do you feel that talk about virtue, which is something that I was hoping you would say more about, because it's a word that we all use, but perhaps we don't really reflect on what it means. So if you could, just give us a quick.
Okay. So very broadly speaking, a virtue is a settled disposition or inclination to feel, to think, and to act in certain ways with respect to certain things. So, for example, let's take the fact we live in a dangerous world. We live in a world we didn't make. We live under conditions we didn't exist, over which we have limited control and so on. And so there's a certain frailty and contingency in our lives. Well, if we're to live well in such a world of such uncertainty, we'll need to cultivate a disposition relevant to that prospect of danger and risk, which is courage. So courage is a settled inclination or disposition to feel, to think, and to act appropriately with respect to danger. So the courageous person is not somebody who never feels fear, but feels fear when it's appropriate to feel fear. They're not destroyed by minor inconveniences or minor dangers. So their feeling with respect to danger is appropriate, measured with regard to the nature of the danger and its impact. Their thoughts, their judgments about the danger are again moderated by this habit, and their actions likewise. So the courageous person doesn't run away at the prospect of any kind of danger, but nor do they run towards the danger. So it's, just to repeat that, these are inclinations or dispositions or habits. Habit is not a good word because we think of a habit as something you might want to get rid of or overcome. It means, but the Latin root of this gives us something. It's something that we have, which is a kind of settled aspect of our character, which we acquire in whatever way. Perhaps to some extent, we have it by nature, but which informs and guides our feeling, our thinking, and our action. And of course, what distinguishes a virtue from a vice? Vices are also settled ways of feeling, thinking, and acting. The difference between a vice and a virtue is not in that conceptual point. It's that virtues are dispositions directed towards the good, and vices are dispositions directed towards the bad. Okay. And so this is where the whole theory of value becomes very important. I think you can't have an account of virtue without having an account of value.
Sure. Makes sense. Wonderful. John, thank you so much for your time, for your generosity, wisdom. We are going to continue now. I hope you will stay and listen to our next speaker. Kim Stanley Robinson is a fantastic science fiction writer. He is the author of more than 20 books, including the international best-selling Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, and more recently, Red Moon, New York 2140, and 2312, which was a New York Times bestseller, nominated for all 7 of the major science fiction awards, a first ever for any book. In 2018, he was named a hero of the environment. So this is a very important aspect of Stan's work. It's not just science fiction as we imagine it. It's science fiction very grounded on what we know about our own planet and potentially our collective future. So he works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute, the Clarence Writers Workshop, and UC San Diego's Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. What a wonderful name. He has won the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and World Fantasy Awards. In 2016, he was given the Highland Award for Lifetime Achievement in Science Fiction, and Asteroid 72432 was named Kim Robinson. Now, that's wonderful. And in 2017, he was given the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Imagination in Service to Society. I met Stan online on a UC University of Colorado Boulder conference called Conference of World Affairs. So here we are again, Stan, back online. One day, hopefully, it's going to be for real. And I'll actually see you as a person as opposed to as a two-dimensional projection. Stan was having some issues with his connection and with StreamYard, which is what we're using. Hopefully these are going to work out. And if they don't, we will improvise to make sure we all hear Stan in some way. Stan, the virtual stage is yours. You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Marcelo, for having me. And I'm hoping that my connectivity and connection with you all is working today better at your end than at mine. I'm on an island in Maine that you're seeing in the reflection behind me, and the internet is not universal. But I hear that you're hearing me, so I'm going to go ahead with my talk, which has to do with our situation in this century as a kind of a crux, so that if you think of the future of humanity, which is the subject of this conference together, it's in doubt, because we are in a crux point so severe that if we don't solve this, our opportunities will be hammered for centuries to come. And this is an unusual moment in human history. And I want to say immediately that probably every generation up to ours has felt that it was in an unprecedented emergency situation. The present, I think, always feels a little bit like that. And all you can say now is that this present situation is even more unprecedented than ever before. And I say that because of the impact of humanity on the biosphere that sustains us, which has never been as severe as it is now, such that this isn't just a dispute between humans, but an inability of humans to live in its sustaining biosphere using its current technologies and practices. So a quick change to a different technological base and set of practices, and therefore I think priorities, or else we're in terrible trouble. I'm not going to outline the trouble very much, but try to focus in this talk on what the positive could look like and how we could get there. So I'm a science fiction writer, a novelist, and I've been practicing that craft and that art form my whole life. And I want to explain to you first what I think that I'm doing, because I'm going to do that again here. So science fiction is stories set in the future. Well, we can never know the future, so it's always speculative, and it gets called speculative fiction for that reason. I call it science fiction because that name is historic, the name of the genre, but also is well chosen, because it emphasizes the overdetermining nature of the sciences in civilization now. 8 billion people alive on this planet is an achievement, an artificial construct that the sciences have platformed and made possible for us by what we've learned and what we've put into practice. So science fiction is a good name, and what it does is a peculiar thing that I want to invoke for you. The image of the kind of glasses that you used to wear to go to 3D movies back when people went to movies and there were 3D movies. You remember those glasses? Each lens would show you a slightly different image that was on the screen, a different version of it. And so what I want to say science fiction is doing is it works that same way. One lens of science fiction is really trying to portray possible futures. That's a good definition right there. They need to be possible from what we know of physics now. But the other lens is using the nova and the distortions of science fiction stories as a metaphor for the way things are and the way they feel right now. So time is accelerating. I feel like a robot or a cyborg, which of course most of us are. These are metaphors for current reality that science fiction projects out into a future in a poetical way. The two combined, the two lenses, if you can make them come together in your head, which is an aesthetic accomplishment as a reader, a kind of co-collaboration, is history. You see time itself in a kind of 3D way. That's the dimension that artificially pops, because of course it's a fiction, and yet for a while you are in fact seeing into the future. And then what that helps is, from the perspective of the science fiction story that you're reading, you can look back at your own moment as if it were historical and judge it in exactly the same way that we now judge certain aspects of our past. That, I think, is a powerful aesthetic, an ethical and philosophical act to take. So there are ramifications, and of course every art form is educational and has moral and philosophical implications. But science fiction is focused on our pondering of the future. So there you have brought into play things that you do in your own life when you contemplate your own futures, expanded out to the collective. So in your own life, you think, well, if I do these things, if I go to school, if I get this job, if I manage to connect up with another person to create a couple, etc., then I will be in a good space. So this is the utopian imaginary. Then on the other hand, middle of the night, fretting, worrying, things are going bad, health, money, family problems. This is the dystopian imaginary, the fear. So hope and fear, these are somewhat future-directed emotions, especially hope. And it's that personal set of the human capability of cognition to imagine itself into a different space than the space that it's in the present moment and place, is precisely the human activity that's given us such immense powers in the world. And we now have to do it again right on a collective basis to get through this next century. So one peculiarity of our moment is, if we do things right, if we cope with the emergency crises that are colliding in these next couple of decades successfully, I'll describe those later, then the potential beyond that to speak of the future of humanity and to let your imagination leap out past this emergency century, well, the potential is quite astonishing. It's a subject for another talk, and I heard the previous speakers speaking of transhumanism, post-humanism. I prefer to think that humanity as we have it is already a kind of benchmark of happiness at its I don't have any ambitions for humans. If we could hold together and be what we are, stay healthy for longer years, that's as much as I want. But that immediately implies that we are going to become cyborgs of a sort. And so it's a blurry border as to what humanity will be if we get into the utopian future and continue to help ourselves, augment ourselves. As I say, topic for another talk. For this one, again, briefly, let's just say that if we create a mass extinction event, which we're right on the edge of doing, which we are beginning, and that we don't come to terms with our carbon loading of the atmosphere, or throwing our carbon waste up into the atmosphere, which then raises the temperature and triggers all kinds of subsequent secondary horrific effects for human beings, that we might not hold together as a civilization. It could drop back into tribalism and a war of all against all, at which point much will be lost, and what might survive will be post-traumatic and damaged in their souls, and many fewer of them, I'm sure. So the bad option is quite bad. The good option is quite promising. And we are now at the point where we have to decide and to execute getting to the good future. So we have the technologies to do this already. There is no need for the invention of brand new technologies or any kind of a silver bullet, which in any case I think doesn't exist, that we are waiting for, that if only we had it, it would solve all our problems. There's two aspects to this. Our problems are multivariant and it needs a multivariant response. There is no one silver bullet. The second thing is we already have invented methods of creating clean energy and clean transport. And these are and also regenerative agriculture, which is to say non-carbon based, in fact, perhaps even carbon negative agriculture. So we need food, we need transport, we need goods that we've made that keep us healthy and comfortable. They're not luxury items, things like refrigerators. They are health items. So the technology is already there, but we are not in an economic system that values them above all else. We are in an economic system that is an improvisation. It's been developed since the beginning of civilization, but in any case, if you call it capitalism, you could say it's been developed since this 15th, 16th century out of feudalism, out of power arrangements in which the few dominated the many and used them for their life support systems. And in the transition to democracy, power shifted from land to money, and accumulations of money are like accumulations of land used to be. And that got highly articulated and elaborated and impressed on the world as rule of law, an international rule of law in a global capitalist system that since around 1980 could be called neoliberal capitalism, which really doubled down on the power of private interests over public interests. Because in the period between World War I and the end of World War II, there was a massive surge in public interest, partly because of the dysfunction of the capitalist system breaking down, but also because of the wars that really, I don't think we need to lay at the foot of capitalism per se. It's more a question of imperialism and colonialism and a bad sense of how to run the world that came to an abrupt end. And the governments of the world took enormous amounts of power in the 30s and in World War II. To a certain extent, you can call this Keynesianism, because John Maynard Keynes was the one who struggled to create an equitable end to World War I on financial terms between the winners and losers of World War I. That did not happen, and it was part of the creation of the various dysfunctions of the 1920s, and then the crash and the depression of the 1930s, and then also World War II. It comes directly out of a misbegotten peace settlement at the end of World War I. And at the end of World War II, the world was so shattered that, as in the Depression, Keynes's advice was followed, And in World War II, a Keynesian world was set up and ran through what the French call the Glorious 30, the Trente Glorieuses, 30 years of growing prosperity for everyone, and still within a capitalist system where the few controlled the resources and the many worked for the few. But it was an accommodation had been made so that the many all felt that they were rising too in those years and were on board with a project that was going to benefit everyone. Starting around 1980 in the neoliberal turn, we've been in 40 years of austerity, which means destruction of the power of the governments to act, and the ascendancy of private interests in finance, banks, however you want to call it, business, that's maybe not the right word, over a government as the state was weakened by the process called privatization. It was all terribly timed, because in those same 40 years, the amount of waste carbon we've poured into the atmosphere and the amount of other wastes and pollutants that are stuffing the biosphere beyond the biosphere's ability to break them back down into harmless substances. The poisoning of our own nest in these years in pursuit of profit over long-term sustainability and prosperity for all has been acute, has led us to the stage we're in now, and has gotten us to a point where we need to make a quick turn. And I'm saying that what I mean is governments have to re-seize finance and put it to work for the good of people in biosphere, money itself. That money needs to be created in the first place by central banks. It's called fiat money because the only money that anybody really trusts is made by states and backed by laws and armies. That's money is social trust, and it means that it's created by our nation state systems, that money created by the central bank needs to be paid out first on purpose by the governments in precisely the way they did during the Depression and especially during World War II, directed towards decarbonization and towards landscape restoration and everything else that we need to do that is not profitable in the current dispensation, and yet it's totally necessary and is for the good of humankind and of the rest of the biosphere's living creatures. So we are living in a stark discrepancy between the international law that everybody abides by, the global financial system that rules where money gets spent, which is to say where people put their work, because some things that get paid for are essentially human work time, which is a finite quantity and needs to be aimed in the right direction. So it also, I want to add here that it's not just decarbonization, it's the salvation of the biosphere as a set of living habitats for the wild creatures that we share this planet with to survive and to prosper. So this is sometimes called biodiversity. Possibly that doesn't fully capture the importance of it. It's not a luxury. It's not us being kind to our foolish and less intelligent cousins. It's a holistic view of this biosphere as something that we're just one part of, and that all parts of it have to be working well. So that's the practical aspect. Then there is also the moral aspect. These creatures have as much right to exist as we do, and driving them into extinction for our own selfish purposes and often foolish purposes is simply something that we, in the science fiction view, looking back at our time, if we don't deal with this, we will be condemned forever as the morally bankrupt generation ever to have lived. So the mass extinction event, the biodiversity crisis, however you want to call that, this is also part of the climate crisis. And I would like to point out that just a couple of weeks ago, the UN issued a report where one of their collections of experts got together and pointed this out, that climate change and biodiversity are two parts of the same global existential challenge facing us, and that we need to rate, for instance, just as an example, the climate change solutions that we might put forth need also to encourage biodiversity, so that if you said that biofuels were a great substitution for fossil fuels for transport, and then you were to turn many of the islands of Indonesia into giant palm oil factories, essentially outdoor factories, and lose the biodiversity of Indonesia, that would be a knock against, indeed a disqualifier for that particular, otherwise perhaps rational decarbonization method. And that by putting these two giant problems together into one macro problem, we can begin to make distinctions and judgments and even cost-benefit analyses, to use that somewhat limited, if not degraded, language. So I wrote about this in my most recent novel called The Ministry for the Future, and I think this is one of the reasons that Marcelo invited me to join this conference, is that novel. I tried to write not a utopian novel, but what Bill McKibben, who was also at this conference, and I would say hi, described as an anti-dystopia, which I think is a really useful way to think of it. Utopia, for one thing, is often an end state that means in the popular parlance that it is something that's never going to happen because it's too perfect or too good or too inhuman. So utopia as a project is always under attack to a certain extent. If you say anti-dystopia, that you're fighting against disaster and the worst kinds of human orders, then that becomes a little more obvious. And also it suggests an active program right now. And again, there can be a utopian novel that you could conceptualize as a best case scenario. This is let's just say, from where we are right now, think yourself out 30 years, and what would be the best case scenario that you could still believe in? And this is a crucial addendum. You don't want to detach from your sense of the reality principle. You want to have every step of the way in this historical description, this scenario, not contravene your sense of what's possible to happen. It might stretch it a little, but it doesn't break it. And of course, that disqualifies any kind of magical solutions and sticks with what we've got. And what we've got right now is indeed the international nation-state system. And a better economic system, a better political economy is not difficult to invent, but we don't have it. So to invent it and to say this would be better is indeed utopian in the bad sense. What you would want is to take the system that we're in now and suggest practical reforms that step by step would lead us into what I call a post-capitalist future, but which we could just dispense with the names and say a best case scenario for going forward from there for further improvements. So, so I wrote that novel in 2019. That was kind of a dark year, and yet the pandemic hadn't happened. Finished the novel, the pandemic happened. A huge shock to me, I have to say. I was as stunned as anyone else, if not more so. And it changed things fast. And I thought my novel appearing in October of 2020 would be rendered inoperative, or not quite redundant, but obsolete even before it came out. But it turns out that's not been true. What we learned as a civilization in the pandemic is that we're all here on one planet together in one biosphere, and something can happen that affects everybody on Earth. Then also, we learned that the sciences are in an intense collaboration, admirable and beautiful to see, transnational and resistant to nationalism, resistant to privatization and to private profit, an intention to keep at the level of the public goods of open source, open science. And the scientific community got together, and the vaccines, the understanding of what this pandemic was that was killing us, and the methodologies that range from the vaccines themselves to public health methodologies were quickly enacted and widely taken up by most people. There are exceptions. There were political problems. There were each nation having put forth a different set of public health solutions to this problem served as a kind of a weird laboratory of different methods to see which ones would work. And social scientists will be studying that for decades to come to learn lessons for better, since that one was another improvisation learned on the fly. Better methodologies will be worked up out of what we've learned out of the pandemic. And then to go back to my novel, for that book to come out in the moment of people getting used to the idea that a big shock had happened. And then there was a change in the administration in the United States, which was by no means inevitable, and shifted over to an administration that believes that it is reenacting the governmental emergency gestures of the New Deal of a century earlier in good ways, bold steps. The situation is radically changed from when I wrote my book. And I want to note some other things. It's impossible to know enough to write a book. And so I confess to a certain craziness in even trying, but it's worth trying anyway. And really the whole science fiction field community ought to be making these tries on a regular basis. And I trust that they will eventually. But what I can say now is that things were happening I didn't know about. So when I wrote in 2019, I wrote in a state of trepidation and of hope and of kind of a stubborn optimism. But I'm not making up ideas. I'm a reporter. I find them in the world and present them in the form so that they all make one larger macro story. So, okay, the Paris Agreement really did exist. And that was an enabling device, not just for my novel, but for the whole world. The place where we can discuss this problem, all nations, in a diplomatic way where we can sort out who does what. And the Paris Agreement, marvelous achievement that it was, insists in its original document on equity, which is to say that the rich nations do more because they did more to create the problem, and they often harmed the interests of the poor nations in the historical past, and the developing nations, often in the tropics, are going to take the first hammering of climate change. So the Paris Agreement acknowledged all that, and equity is written into that document. That was a great enabler for me, and indeed my Ministry for the Future, which is fictional, is just an arm, a committee of the Paris Agreements. So that was something that already existed, I knew about. But I wrote at length about the central banks inventing carbon quantitative easing and instituting it and paying for good work and making a rapid transition. That's sort of the main strand of my plot. And so in my novel, they have to struggle hard, and only after stupendous catastrophes, and sometime in the 2030s, I keep dates off of it, but it's implied that it's quite a bit far out before the central banks begin to act on this matter. Well, unbeknownst to me, the central banks gathered to make the network for greening the financial system in 2017 or 2018. It's 89 central banks, including all the big ones that you would want to be there, that in some ways are, their nation states are in supposed conflict with each other, but the central banks are working together. They have many suggestions for greening the world's financial system. And my carbon coin in my novel is either a symbol for these many methods that the central banks have already thought up on their own in more detailed and actionable terms, or else a carbon coin idea would be another one to add to the list that they've already made. That was good to learn about. Also, I wrote about some people call it geoengineering. I want to recommend to everybody to think of what we were calling geoengineering as climate restoration. This new name, I think, clarifies why we would want to do something on purpose to the global system, having done so many things by accident. It seems a little audacious and perhaps frightening. So geoengineering has a bad name, perhaps for good reasons. Climate restoration might make it clearer that we might want to do things to get ourselves back out of the bad zone of the hotter Earth that we're headed for now. In any case, I wrote about one that I think is unobjectionable on any terms, which is to say to drain the liquid water out from under the glaciers, the ice of the glaciers in Antarctica. They have speeded up their slide into the sea because they are being lubricated by water that melts on the surface and then drains down through cracks to the bottom of the glaciers, floats them a little so that they slide, in many cases, 10 times faster than they used to. Pumping that water out from the bottom of the glaciers might slow them back down to their original speed. You could call it geoengineering, but I don't see why. It wouldn't be climate restoration, it would be sea level stabilization. And without sea level stabilization, we've already baked up. The beaches are doomed. The coastal cities, which are huge drivers of human civilization and home to 10 to 15% of the whole human race, those cities are in terrible trouble too. So stabilizing the great glaciers of Antarctica and Greenland seems to me a great idea. I was told this idea by a single glaciologist, and I vetted it with other glaciologists, and they said, yeah, it might work. So I put it in the book as an experiment that does end up working. And just recently, I came across a paper published in Nature, which is really the gold standard of general scientific journals in our world, and a paper in Nature that was doing all of the numbers on this proposed Antarctic glacial slowdown scheme and concluding that it might work and would not be impossible. And indeed, the methods, the machinery, the infrastructure, precisely the same kind of infrastructure that the oil industry uses now, simply pumps, drills, etc., all of which the oil industry really needs to stop using because we need to keep the fossil fuels that we've identified around this earth in the ground, or else we're truly cooked. Then again, I wrote about habitat corridors and about E.O. Wilson's half-Earth system, which proposes that we leave half the earth to the wild animals. A bold, audacious, and wild-sounding scheme, and yet now the Biden administration has proposed 30 by 30, that we protect 30% of the land for the wild animals by 2030. That's a big step along the way. And what's turned out is that it's not too frightening to make these proposals or these plans, set these goals, because there is a lot of already empty land on this planet. Humans are tending to concentrate into cities, and if we made it a structured movement into cities and cleared out the rest of the land that isn't being used for agriculture in organized ways, we might be able to achieve habitat for a lot of the wild animals to prosper in our absence, and then we would also be in a much better state. Just last month or 2 months ago, Tony Hiss published a book called Rescuing the Planet, which is a history of this project predating E.O. Wilson, describing the current status of it and showing that many people have been working on this biodiversity habitat corridor idea for decades, and that it is a great plan that's already well underway and approved by a lot of people. A project that a lot of people naturally love out of what Wilson called biophilia. So with these things, feels remarkably different to 2019. I'm reminded, being as old as I am, of the change in feeling between, say, 1978 and 1982. There can be rapid cultural changes. Now, there is path dependency. Cultural change is like faster than technological infrastructure-based change, which often has time. Change can turn in a moment of awareness, because we're talking here about what Raymond Williams called a structure of feeling, that a culture has a structure of feeling in which it slots its own emotions and its feeling for what's going on. You can say ideology or worldview, Weltanschauung, paradigm, religion. I like structure of feeling for the way it encompasses maybe the important thing about it, which is how we feel about the historical moment that we're in. I think, and the climate scientist Michael Mann suggested this to me when we talked early this year, that we might be seeing a cultural tipping point. And we've talked about climate tipping points, and I think those exist and are dangerous as can be. A cultural tipping point would mean that now everybody's on the slide towards climate restoration, biosphere restoration, equality, an end to inequality, which means also equity, and that's subject for another talk, that justice and sustainability are the driving goals, not profit. The idea that everybody individually seeking profit is going to end up in result of all their efforts has been tried and proved wrong. And so now we need to all pull together. And I think that structure of feeling is developing. So with that, I'm going to bring it to a close and hope, I hope that you've heard me, and I hope that I can hear Marcelo. If I'm very sorry about my connectivity. If that, I tell you what, if I can't understand him, if you will wait, we'll briefly connect by phone, and maybe we can be connected up that way. But let's give it a try.
Yeah, Stan, I have a suggestion before.
You're sounding great.
Awesome. If something goes bad, just cut off your camera and just use StreamYard as audio, because that kills the bandwidth by a lot, and that may solve the problem. But let's hope we won't have to go there. So Thank you so much. Yeah, there you go. So he is listening to us, people, and can you say something, Kim, just to know that you're there? Stan, can you talk? Maybe he can't talk. I don't know if he dropped completely or if he's just not in audio. Let me send him a chat saying, just to try, just asking Stan to say something, see if I can hear him. We can hear him. I guess he dropped. Well, you always have to look at the glass half full, right? And the glass half full here is that.
Hey, Marcelo?
Yes.
I have Stanley on the phone, and I'm going to keep him on speakerphone. So let's see if this works.
Okay. Let's see, Stan, can you talk? Can you say something so we can see if we can hear you?
Yes, Marcelo, I'm hearing you quite well in a kind of a speakerphone way.
Okay.
How do I sound?
You sound great. You just had a brain transplant from Stanley to Dan, and so Dan is now your voice. So the image of Dan.
Actually, I'm going away.
Okay, Dan disappeared. Okay, so now we're good again. We're good again.
I'm very sorry about this. I'll try to connect up again with I lost you entirely. I'm going to try to connect up again with this StreamYard connection. But in the meantime, let's just chat. And even if we do reconnect, I hope maybe to mute myself and be visible, but talk through the phone.
You sound actually great right now. And the way it's working, we have a picture of you on the screen so people can.
Oh, good. Okay, great.
We're good. And we only have like 6 minutes or so. So we should just proceed.
Yes.
So, okay. So there are a few questions from the audience. And as I always say, even though I have a bunch, I'd like to honor them first. So here we have, are there unique lessons we can learn from science fiction that we cannot learn from other forms of fiction? So that's a very broad question about science fiction in general.
No, I appreciate that one very much. And thank you to the questioner. I think so. I think reading science fiction is a habit of mind that stretches your sense of what humanity and what civilization is. It's a form of thinking about history. And as I said at the start of my talk, you put yourself out into an imagined future and look back at our time, and our time looks very strange in a process of a cognitive estrangement, they say, in the theory of science fiction. Cognitive estrangement can be a powerful thing. It resembles what Brecht did in his plays. And then I guess what I would say also is if you read a lot of science fiction, well, the space opera is really a form of fantasy, so it's like reading fantasy. You read it for the fun of the stories and for zipping around the galaxy. That is a form of science fiction, and I'm fond of it. But the one that I think is useful as a tool of thinking is more the science fiction that tries to describe the near future or the next couple hundred years. That latter zone is one I'm particularly interested in because it's not often tried.
It's rather illuminating as to where we are now, and it's a lot of fun to try it because it seems like history's accelerated and things are going very fast. And then to end, if you read a lot of these near future and mid-future science fiction things, what you get is a complete spread from apocalypse to utopia and everything in between, but you begin to get more comfortable with the idea that what we do now has consequences that could be positive. And so between the pleasures of it as an art form of storytelling and the historical lessons that it can give us, I think science fiction is, I've been calling it the realism of our time. And I think no matter how you regard that, the slogan, it is definitely really useful now to be reading it, if you find the right time.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. So it's more than just what's next. It's really a mirror to who we are and where we could go or not, in that sense. Talking about that, there's another question here, which is a little more dystopian, but perhaps you have something to say about this. It says, it is actually coming all the way from Brazil. Will it be possible to write a fiction book in partnership with AI? You would write one page, the AI would interpret and dictate the second, and so on. I have an opinion about that, but I'll let you say something first.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I must say, I've had to think about this one really hard because my novel Aurora from 2015 has 5 of its 7 chapters narrated by an artificial intelligence.
Oh, okay.
And so I pretended the situation described by the questioner from Brazil. And it was hugely fun to think about the limitations of artificial intelligence as opposed to our own consciousness. And an AI writing a novel ends up doing what we used to call camera eye point of view. It can observe things, it can describe things that it sees. It can't read minds, it can't get into motivations with any sense of sympathetic understanding. But a camera eye point of view is often extremely powerful. Some great novels are written that way, some great fiction. So I had fun with it, and I would be one of the first to get in line to try an experiment of co-authoring something with AI. But what I know of algorithms teaches me is they're going to be really bad at it. There is no algorithm. There aren't any lessons. Writing fiction is an improvisation that has to do with the human feelings and consciousness combination. And there is no algorithm that is powerful enough to grasp all that. So they might be bizarre or simple, but they would be interesting as what they reveal of the people who wrote the algorithms, or what the algorithms are implying.
Yeah, I would say an analytical observer of humanity may not be a very good storyteller. That's but we'll see. Who knows? Okay, so a more just a last really quick question coming from myself. Actually, it's just, you mentioned quite correctly that one of the things the pandemic has done has showed to everyone that wants to see it how codependent and how unified we are now, in this planet, in terms of our fragility, in terms of our collective needs, etc. And yet, we are very geopolitically fragmented, which makes it extremely hard to enact this sort of anti-dystopian view that you were presenting before, which is the notion of creating kind of globally active initiatives that can actually make a difference. And so how do you see this progressing? I know there is, and I love this notion of the cultural tipping point, and maybe this is the way it's going to go, but I'd like to know if you realistically believe that this is going to be happening within the time frame that we need it to happen.
Yeah. Well, it's the question of our time, isn't it? This is, you really just put your finger on the crux of what we're facing. We have a planetary problem that's biospheric. We have a human nation-state system that is, the nation-state system is devoted to each nation-state defending its own interests against all the rest in what we call geopolitics. So how? Well, on the one hand, that zeitgeist, that sense of a general intellect that everybody in the world wants it and will push their political representation to achieve it. But then also the nation state system is meeting at the Paris Agreement under the aegis of the Paris Agreement, like COP26 in Glasgow this year, and then there's a diversity Congress of Parties, COP15 in October. So all the nations get together to talk this over. Now, of course, every representative of every nation is going to be looking out for their nation's best interest. And that's the rub. If it becomes competitive, like let's make the other nations do it and we'll come in last with least because that will cost us less, then we're all in big trouble. At that point, everybody will lose. So what's interesting is in some of these ways, the necessary moves that we make to decarbonize fast and to protect biodiversity might actually accrue huge amounts of value to the people who get into the game first. So this is what a lot of people are pegging their hopes on, is the right action, the virtuous action for the biosphere. If any one nation state leads the way on that, they may end up being the beneficiary. Their own citizens may benefit from being first in the technological innovation and development and deployment and manufacturing. So on a practical level, even if you're thinking still, as many people will be, a competitive advantage over the other actors, other nation states, you might secure competitive advantage by being first to do the good things. And there's a big piece of hope you can hang on that one, I think.
That's a great answer, and I really do hope you're right, and I'm also very optimistic of what's John Haldane said about the new saints of the young generation, and how they're quite aware of what's going on and understand that that's going to be their world, and they have to make sure we have a decent one for them. Stan, look, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much for struggling with technology, which is another call for for internetization of the whole world, including rural areas. And I really appreciate it. And I hope you stick around so that we can continue this. But we need to go for a quick break now. And we're going to have at 1:45, we're going to have Mary Flanagan. She's going to be talking about love in the glitch, humanizing the future. And Mary is a wizard of using video games to actually as a force for social change. And she's also from Dartmouth. So I'm very, very happy that she's going to be joining us very soon. But before that, we have a quick break. And we'll be back at, 1:45 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Phew, now it's complicated, man. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I don't know exactly why my light is fluctuating like that, but bear with us. I'm really, really happy to introduce our next speaker. Before I do that, I remind you that this is our final two presentations for this conference, unfortunately. And I have two wonderful speakers, Mary Flanagan, who will come right now, and then Elizabeth Kolbert, who is going to be the final speaker of the conference. So Mary Flanagan is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor in Digital Humanities here at Dartmouth College. She is a thought leader in the realm of games, digital culture, and human values, and she's also an artist who works with works that has been exhibited in museums and galleries around the world, such as the Whitney, the Guggenheim, Tate Britain, and other global institutions. In 2018, Dr. Flanagan won the Award of Distinction at the Prix Art Electronica and is currently building artificial intelligences, which is, I think, the main topic of her conversation with us today. She has held numerous fellowships, has published 6 books, including Critical Play and Values at Play in Digital Games with Helen Nissenbaum, which is an MIT Press book. And Flanagan is the Sherman, as I mentioned before, she is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor in Digital Humanities, and she's also a chair of Film and Media Studies here at Dartmouth College. And the topic of her talk today is, and I'm very glad to hear this title, I have to say, Love in the Glitch, Humanizing the Future.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you so much for your invitation to join everybody. These talks have been really, really fantastic. So I'm really appreciative. And hopefully everything's working. You can hear me, etc.
We're all good. We're all good.
Excellent. All right. Are you ready? I want to start my time off today with the idea of perspective, of viewpoints. Whose viewpoints exactly are shaping our technologies and in turn shaping our cultures? If the last year has taught us anything, it's that many people around the globe are relying on network technologies to be present and to connect to coworkers, with loved ones, to learning environments. We've all been through it, right? Just as we simultaneously realize technology has made no one immune to global catastrophes of this scale. We're over a generation into ubiquitous computing as an age, so to speak, and the cultural norms that come with this phase change in human history. We've connected across time and space, volunteered, taken yoga classes, conducted research, ordered takeout, gone to cocktail parties, visited the doctor online, and that's just in one particular class of people. Refugees have been able to access maps and seek help. Shut-ins have found easier, if more expensive, ways to get groceries. Governments have tracked COVID cases, and businesses have had the opportunity for plenty of disruption, productive disruption, if you look at it in an optimistic way. The fourth industrial revolution, which is the AI and machine learning revolution, is promised by think tanks like the World Economic Forum is now upon us. And like a lot of other folks in this conference, I'm really interested in investigating artificial intelligence and machine learning because they're on the rise, both of the computational phenomenon and a cultural force in our cultural and intellectual narratives. And more concretely, of course, in our daily lives as devices such as Alexa and Roomba make their way into homes and listen to our online conferences and other daily tasks that we've discovered throughout this conference. So this shiny techno future has several dark dimensions to mire our potential futures and unseen and unaddressed problems. As some of the prior speakers have also suggested, perhaps the most deleterious aspects of our current age lie rooted in ourselves, in human biases and how human biases pervade our technologies. Computer programs are often seen as a neutral lifeboat in the sea of human error, but technologies such as AI really do break. And like COVID exposing our global and local vulnerabilities, so too does breaking AI show us that we have a long way to go in the creation of technology for a just society. An urgent challenge is that no matter what the field, AI and its intersection with the world is overwhelmingly dominated by men who seek to solve problems in ways particular to global science and engineering training, with the promise of Silicon Valley profit as the central goal. Most engineering and CS programs do not center on ethics and values, but rather on efficiency, reliability, profitability, as entrepreneurship programs proliferate in tech fields at universities. We have one as well. Indeed, in a variety of emerging technological realms, the purely technical applications and the creative ones, it is women, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and globally marginalized groups who are left out of the conversations around AI writ large, and AI, whether in the design, the coding, the intent, or the logic behind AI systems. And so today I'm going to propose a shift on how we might reimagine AI, starting with the arts and starting with women. I draw heavily on feminist writers like Sandra Harding, who coined the term standpoint theory to recognize that our gaze, from where each of us stands, has particular affordances, strengths, and weaknesses. Originating in the 1970s, standpoint theory asks us to recognize that knowledge is socially situated and that marginalized people, first and foremost, women and women with overlapping identities of difference, hold a key to understanding power relations with privilege. Feminists like Patricia Hill Collins, Dorothy Smith, Nancy Harstock, and Donna Haraway tell us from backgrounds as diverse as sociology, political science, biology, and physics that we must take into account women's lived experiences into the production of knowledge. Further, race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw added significantly to this understanding by pointing out that it's intersectional differences that compound underprivileged perspectives, the idea that people experience discrimination differently depending on their mesh of lived identities within systems of oppression. All of this work started with second wave feminists trying to unpack hierarchies of oppression. My question to explore here today is one that continues to pursue Crenshaw's recognition of overlapping viewpoints from the point of view of the creation of technologies. Given the monolithic myths around AI and ML, we can blame Hollywood or other cultural imaginaries. I set out to create an intersectional feminist AI in order to challenge and change the conversations around AI and its roles in our collective societies. What would an intersectional feminist technology look like? What might be an intersectional AI and what would it make? Could such an approach humanize our technologies? Let's go back in time. Building on a 200-year-old critique. The current global pandemic has demonstrated that advances in technology have deep impact from macro to micro scale, not only in terms of planetary impact in the industrial age, with humans sculpting and degrading the earth. The era we all know is the Anthropocene. But the lasting consequences lie also within our very understanding of our places and ourselves. The West's faith in science has rippled during the pandemic, and at least Americans have reflected upon how much control we felt we had before all this happened. People like control, and it's a problem. Among the earliest critiques of the anthropocenic fantasy over control of life dates back to Mary Shelley's 1818 book, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Though it may seem unfashionable to look back 200 years for answers to today's challenges, there are deep lessons to be learned for the future of humanity. Shelley's misguided 19th century doctor, like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, had a God complex, hoping to create a new species that would, quote, bless him as creator. And he gave in to the enticements of science and created a creature that owed its being to him, hinting at the ongoing addiction to innovation that pervades today's tech world. This desire drove the actions of the good doctor and also eerily describes the culture of innovation that emerges in tech entrepreneurship. From the precarious rightsless workers in the gig economy to on-demand series out there, this ongoing class differential and pervasive fantasy of the superiority of Western science over the domination of intelligence, the lure of the call-on-demand servitude, embodied or artificial. These concepts are deeply steeped in 19th century European colonialist thinking and colonial values. The intentions of Dr. Frankenstein that may initially seem to be of an individual were in fact cumulative, a product of growing knowledge, Western scientific thinking, and a European-dominated colonial context, just as the industrialization that led to our current collective anthropocenic moment. Shelley's narrative is both inspirational and a warning. In the making of artificial golems, robots, AIs, are these fulfilling some kind of colonial desire, planting the seeds for schemes of domination and control? Shelley pinpoints the inexhaustible ambition of technological advancement at the cost of technological ethics. Is the same colonialist thinking at the heart of Frankensteinian science still at work in the development of virtual intelligences? The novel and the monsters she created sparked this critical conversation, ones whose results we must constantly process anew. So let's get a little bit more advanced in time and go back to the 1950s, because debates specifically around the ethical issues regarding computational artificial intelligence, and I believe Adam mentioned this, go back to the 1950s to Dartmouth College, where Marcelo and I work. Whereas when a small group of white male scientists first coined the term at a Dartmouth College meeting, artificial intelligence, there's a plaque, we have one on a building. Across the Atlantic, Alan Turing's 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, posed the compelling questions, can machines think, which has driven countless research initiatives since its release. Who decides what intelligence is? Whose perspectives are included in the processing of creating intelligence? And invoking a point better articulated by science fiction than by scientists themselves, what is the role of the human? Creator, colleague, collaborator, or master? Again, few women and people of color researchers, at least in the United States, have had the opportunity to lead this conversation on the ground. But AIs have been reimagined in women's sci-fi in quite interesting ways. Nalo Hopkinson, for just one example, in her novel Midnight Robber, models her knowledgeable household AI on Aishu, the Western African deity. N.K. Jemison's short stories Trojan Girl and Valedictorian look at how AIs emerge on their own and either hide, kind of referencing hidden biases in AI, or separate entirely from humanity. Literary imagination has expanded how AI works from an intersectional viewpoints. Getting technological systems to actually do it is the next task. So as this talk continues, I'll show how I'm creating systems that work differently. Bruno Latour once speculated that technology is society made durable. And I love that quote. I use it all the time. But technology too conversely shapes society. In either way, whether we like it or not, and the scenarios produced by terrifying anthropocenic stories, according to Cornell professor Holly Jean Buck, we may need to rewrite them. Anthropocenic end-of-the-world narratives show us two things. First, that our narratives about this era continue to place humans and their technologies yet again front and center. And second, according to psychologists, scare tactics and close-to-home stories rarely work well as change strategies. In social change work, Timothy Wilson has long argued that tactics like scared straight programs to keep youth out of prison and the dare to keep your kids off drug program, these kind of programs have consistently backfired. So if I put on one of my other hats really briefly as a researcher running a pro-social game design laboratory called Tilt Factor at Dartmouth College, we've researched this as well. And in a randomized controlled study, we found that using a fantastic story like a zombie invasion versus merely setting the story about the spread of a virus, this was actually 10 years ago. Strange that this game has like entered our lives. We had a virus set in the player's neighborhood. The zombie narrative was more effective at changing minds about public health, about funding, and about vaccines in our study. So the story we tell about the time we are in is of utmost importance. I don't think most public, and like Fauci would probably not have listened to me had I said, okay, let's make this a zombie apocalypse. Everyone's going to get vaccinated. But actually, research suggests that that might not have been a bad idea. As Stanley Robinson just noted in his last talk, science fiction is the realism of our time. And I think it's really important to note that. And also note the number of us in this two-day seminar who looked at the AI as the future of humanity. Really interesting. All right, so the stories and examples regarding AI and machine learning then are central to this narrative imagining. Human technology and the stories that contextualize it create sometimes instantaneously their own context and actively shape society, even without the public's understanding that this narrative is self-fulfilling. In other words, if the offhand decisions made by a handful of privileged people, informed by past narratives of dominance and power, or of what works for profitable tech and current entrepreneurial models, this becomes embedded in the logics of our technical systems and can quickly become as durable and as durable as social and cultural norms of the traditional past. Yes, research in science and technology studies has long established that technologies are not neutral. Thomas Kuhn, Heidegger, we can go to McKinsey and Wachman, lots of folks, Langdon Winter, Bruno Latour, Habermas. But additional research in the values design community has shown that computational systems contain bias and are working to try to mitigate it. So technologies are in fact ideological and even political, as Langdon Winter has suggested. Those who create technologies like AI play a powerful role in our fundamental concept of intelligence, knowledge, and even consciousness. As we already know, there is a tendency, a pervasive bias, to believe that computers and computational systems are neutral due to their access to massive amounts of data. The popular adage, "data doesn't lie," is implicated here. Technologies, for the most part, are still perceived as fair. Indeed, psychologists have long pointed out people's tendency to have automation or technology bias, an unconscious urge to trust computational processes. And data justice advocates have begun fighting for digital rights and access to the hidden processes of emerging technologies and their power to sort, categorize, and, if necessary, for the right to intervene. So, recent exposés of implicit bias embedded into common AI systems are damning and have already been discussed to some extent. Sue Halpern did a great job listing so many of these, so I won't dwell on this nice long list, but if it comes up again, we can talk about racist Google searches to activists seeing their data deleted by AIs, looking for extremism. Suffice to say, it seems that neutral sources of big data, huge collections of image and texts, are exposed as containing viewpoints, values, and epistemologies, standpoints long recognized by feminist critiques of science and psychology fields. The World Economic Forum noted that AI is failing the next generation of women in 2019 due to the way biases are perpetuated and the obvious lack of women in the field. Only 12% of AI and ML researchers are women. Even fewer women and BIPOC scholars and artists have access to the technological expertise needed to study such systems in depth. Many are left out of the conversation that is imagining, producing, and making AI. So these intersectional feminist perspectives, those that recognize a constellation of differences to form a viewpoint, I believe will improve AI and ML and call attention to the glitches, both as accidental and intentional, in the development and use of such systems. By creating an experiment towards what's possible, it is my hope to contribute more ethical foundations for tech development. We must shape how AI works across a spectrum of people and their standpoints, and identify how code can be shaped for equity and inclusion. But how? And this is where I really want to introduce and dwell on the idea of the glitch. What are glitches? Broken code, hidden Easter eggs, corrupt files, human errors, messed up screens, gaps in 3D game worlds that someone forgot to fix, hiccups in memory allocation, loopholes for exploits, weak remote desktop protocols, bias to data sets, scrambled text, jumbled sorting, bad keywords, copy paste gone wrong, and other. The list goes on. Typically, the glitch is an accident, a problem to solve, or even a danger. AI and machine learning, like any code, are systems filled with glitches. The problem is very few people know how they operate, and then, of course, finding meaning in the glitch itself. Glitches, in my view, are a collaboration between people and computers. And sometimes they lie more on the fault of a computational limitation, but most times the result of human error. So what would happen if we own up to and celebrate the fact of glitches, breakages, biases, vulnerabilities, and all? We will be, in essence, humanizing technology, not making it human, but humanizing it, recognizing all the foibles and fictions and messy bits, the delays, the letdowns. We should love them for what they teach us, because they teach us who we are, these broken systems. Can we learn to use AI for perspectives, for a viewpoint, as a standpoint, but not the truth? Inspired by sci-fi authors as well as scholars like Holly Jean Buck, who call on researchers to retell stories of the Anthropocene, that is to say, not to deny what is happening, but to engage with a vision given current conditions, I'll finally get to my exemplar project. Arguing that dystopian narratives permit militarization and mentalities of scarcity, which could encourage greed, hoarding, and mass extinction, and massive efforts to extract resources which would impact economic, financial, psychological, and other real-world aspects. Buck instead urges us to focus on what is possible and find enchantment to engage with the world we have. So enchantment. Enchantment is something artists do pretty well. So therefore, I aim to rewrite the AI ML story, starting with code. My conceptual goals aim for an intentionally biased system, a pro-women system, a system that prioritizes women's labors and logic. Since I'm an artist, my goal is to use the code itself as a critical tool. I'm working with my system to create new intersectional series of images with an AI trained on a corpus using only artwork by women. As far as the computer vision algorithm, I'm using what's called a deep convolutional general adversarial network, a now common algorithm model used in computational vision research. After the lengthy training process, the system exports totally original images from its knowledge base of what is learned in little 8x8 grids. I call the system Grace AI. And I'll detail several aspects of how the project interrogates AI through a feminist lens. But first, we need to take a deep dive into training data and archives. All right. For my own project's training data, I needed to create a collection of visual artworks by women artists. Typically, to train an AI, tens of thousands of exemplars are necessary. This is why you have researchers using Reddit and Google News to train text generators, for example, because the access to scale is key. So to collect images, I started looking around at collections of many, many artworks, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Louvre and other kinds of institutions where there should be massive, massive databases. But first, of course, I looked at the internet as well. So in the first place, I used a web scraper implemented in Python to download available images, sorting through the thousands of images using custom-made tool to verify works are by women. Because if you write women artists as a search term, you are going to get artists painting women because that's the majority of things, that's the majority of data that has actually been saved. So we had to use a lot of supervised learning to create and observe what was being collected and actually hand sort it to make sure it was correct. So, you know, yes, this is actually a work by a woman artist. Very difficult to verify. It took forever. And it's taking forever. It's an ongoing process because gathering the training data set for the AI was and remains the most difficult aspect of the project. In short, most women's art hasn't been preserved, cataloged, and archived. Hidden biases pervade art records and archives when they do exist. Bias, of course, was present in art history before the technical systems were there to exacerbate the problem. Classic surveys such as art critic Earl Shin's 3-volume The Art Inventory of America, among other sources, has been called out as male and Eurocentric. And in fact, the entire Western art history canon has long been recognized as overly white and male. But while collection practices are changing and kind of changing rapidly, international record structures and records lag decades, if not centuries behind. So in archives, first there are these kind of circumstantial biases, such as when not much is known of a work. So it's anonymous or some kind of object that's created. Aspects about the work, age or material, they're decontextualized, mostly a guess. The second bias comes in when this idea of inclusion, in library terms, collection bias. That is the imbalance of the work that has been collected, been documented within the institution. So, for example, many US collections are Euro-Western centric, so discovering global artists is a challenge, and discovering global artists whose identity is recorded means it's a double challenge. Western white and male-centric bias is influenced into the collections and even identification of who is an artist in the first place. So, for example, in the last 5 years, the classic US institutions such as the MoMA and the Whitney Museum of Art have made efforts to diversify and improve collections to include women and people of color, with the Whitney adding 300 new works and 60 new artists to the collection just in 2019 alone. Yet it is sobering that from 2008 to 2017, just 2.37% of all acquisitions and gifts and 7.6% of exhibitions at the top 30 United States museums have been work by African American artists. and work by women artists constitutes a mere 11% of acquisitions from major US museums and 14% of exhibitions over the past decade. So this problem is not going away as quickly as one would hope. So with these dismal numbers, given the present and hopefully more informed moment, one can only speculate at the number of women and diverse creators left out of archives completely. Even if more material were in a collection per se, the material may not be archived. As an example, for the 2019 Pompidou retrospective of artist Dora Maar, the photographer and painter, the museum at the Pompidou committed to digitizing and cataloging nearly 1,900 of her negatives that had been sitting in storage. While much of Maar's work was scattered or lost in the aftermath of her death, auctioned off for a pittance at the time as there were no apparent heirs, it is amazing that the Pompidou housed what is only a fraction of her life's work. So there is no data about the quantity of women artists' archives that are inaccessible compared to men's, or how many archive collections are by women, or what has been lost. It is certain that the work of male artists has been the best preserved and digitized in the world. And in part, this is due to the colonial impulse behind museums to begin with, and an impulse actually that's been identified cross-culturally. That's another story. So what happens in Silicon Valley, unfortunately, does not stay in Silicon Valley, and biases emerge from the .com industry's surface and library and archival tools. Reedsma, for example, has published astute work regarding biases in library discovery systems from EBSCO to OCLC. Researchers have identified system-level biases in web searches, and some scholars are pointing out gaps in state-sponsored archives as entrenched in colonial narratives. So a third bias can emerge from data management and what I call the historicity bias. Seemingly neutral phenomenon, such as the design of databases, in fact contain viewpoints and values. Yet even if women's artwork is valued, digitized, saved, and stored, there is still the likelihood of historicity bias, also called the findability problem. In this sense, I simply mean the way artworks have been recorded, they offer no means by which to discern diversity among artists, as the design of databases assume the artists to be white men. Most art databases, from the Pompidou to the Getty to the Tate to the French National Joconde system, do not record or facilitate searching by gender, even if gender of the artist is well known. In most public art databases, Artstor, Wikimedia Commons, Google Arts and Culture, to Artcyclopedia, gender, language, ethnicity, etc. are not searchable categories when looking for art. Across such archives, information on race, ethnicity, culture, sexuality, gender, language, sexual preference, active period of career, for ageism, all of these things are overlooked. In 2020, when I was working on this project, the Metropolitan Museum of Art added gender as a category in its collections database and gave me the API to be possibly the first person to be searching this collection. And out of 375,000 high-res images of work accessible online from the collection, my scrape to look for women artists unearthed 500 works from the Museum of Metropolitan Art that were definitively attributed to women artists. Thus, biases pervade even those technical systems created for cultural heritage institutions, and this bias has prohibited accessing diverse bodies of work around the world. Across our emerging technological realities, from applications to intelligence systems, women and people of color are left out of the data that feeds these codes. So now I'm going to start a couple of slides for you, because I wanted to show you the process that I'm working on to make this a reality. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, let's get out of there. Here's some women. Love this painting of women actually in a studio painting. It's like a very rare painting. So this is the kind of thing you might find when you are, if you run a Google search and you just start looking for women painters, and you end up not getting only women painters. You end up getting a lot of painting by women. This is when I actually started cleaning the data, and I wanted to show you the image on the right is the beginning of some ways that I'm the output of my AI. So here I have, you'll see some images floating by, and those are the images actually getting processed in the data. And then you see this top image up here having a result. So this is the AI running, trying to actually learn from these images by women artists and create a new image from that work. So I'm just going to stop here and go back to some text here. So employing her DC GAN, Grace AI is trained to see from a data set I continue to create that contains tens of thousands of paintings and drawings by women artists. These are figurative drawings. This particular set is figurative. In effect, it's a history of global women's art in thousands of images. The artists I have chosen as her teachers are mostly any artist, woman artist I can find who's doing figurative work from up to about the 1960s, when it's really difficult to actually separate figurative work for abstractions. So it's a little bit of earlier generations. And but by being an artist, and in different times, they would obviously have to be outspoken, strong individuals from countries ranging from Korea to Greece to Argentina to Nigeria, working in a male-dominated art world, because all art worlds were male-dominated at that time, and especially painting. These paintings are a multiplicity of intersections: language, schooling, space-time, lived experience. The National Museum of Women in the Arts and the University of Indiana Space of their own database, as part of the Eskenazi Museum of Art, shared their entire collections with me. And I mentioned the Metropolitan Museum of Art with the API. So I have, after getting this massive data, a massive initial scrape, I continue to build the database name by name. For women are so utterly underrepresented, they have to be discovered at almost like an ongoing research project. You wouldn't think that would be this hard to do. Women artists seem like a common category of things, but my data set continues to grow. I'm collecting the requisite thousands of images and feeding the system, but it's never perfect. It's never a simulacrum of a human. If anything, AI gives us the opportunity to have a conversation, system with human, human with system, and of course, an engagement with art. A system like Grace AI makes no aesthetic judgments, no quality judgments, no emotional judgments. The algorithm merely pits training against the introduction of random data to produce something new. As the artist deploying this conceptual system, however, I was surprised by the resulting emotional and aesthetic resonances. As Grace AI fumbles through data, registering volumes and volumes of information, organizing it, and making sense of it in her way, I watched the results emerge while situated in a complex rubric of ideas about art, authorship, materiality, memory, tradition, and expression. It is clear that Grace AI's work differs from the work produced by AIs using primarily white painter data sets that form a default if one merely just searches the web for paintings. Training on women's work, seeded with a bit of the universe's aleatoric methods, Grace AI's aesthetic emerges as something impressionistic with these beautiful colors. And there's another one, yes. Oops, here. Trying to move forward in my little image. There's some more. Compositionally, the images generated have a surprisingly complex structure. They craft the system crafts an entirely different mood each time it's run. Thus, these voices emerge with various global artist styles influencing each training a bit differently, each successive output of the system unique and varying. I've had to resist the urge to compare or aggregate these works as a kind of visual census taking. I've been asked if women choose particular palettes by people curious about the project because of what we may learn from women painters. This is precisely the point of the project. Focusing on intersectionality means, for me, to resist the urge to categorize and contain these images, to refute tendencies, to make assumptions and aggregates, to appear to contribute to knowledge, as we have framed it. For what would that knowledge be truly? I find beauty in the lack of precision, the borrowing, the generating. In the end, one can feel the traces of cross networks of hundreds of years of women's hands and hearts crafting unique works. And through the arts, viewers may be able to get a sense of a feeling about the science that goes into AI and machine learning. These images make the public curious about the process of creating art with computers as well. For the first exhibition of images by Grace, I wanted to set the work within artificial life origin story with conceptual roots in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm clearly a fan. So after training the system on thousands of images, the system was directed to look at internet images of the Frankenstein monster. In essence, the first training forms for the algorithm what is possible to see, and the next phase of training shifts the gaze. So, trained on women artists, go to look at Frankenstein. The rendered images were output from the system and collected on dye sub prints. And the origin story Frankenstein images had their global premiere in Cyprus, and with a US premiere in A Question of Intelligence, an exhibition curated by Christian Paul that was shut down during the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic. So here's what we have, some images for you to consider. On the right, women painters, and then afterwards, on the left, women painters, and on the right, being introduced to Frankenstein-looking creatures. The images are monstrous. Some channel Francis Bacon as a kind of subliminal horror. Others are bleak, even faceless faces. Some are marked by strange proportions, as if children's drawings. Contrary to AI systems criticized for their lack of humanness, the images produced by the system can barely contain their emotion. They are not derivative images, however. The works are original, unimagined as singular creations, but rather hold threads from a global collective zeitgeist. The most exciting thing about the project is to feel these voices emerge, morph, and grow into new expressions. No, the images that come from the project are not accurate. They are not efficient. But these engineering platforms are not what makes art. No, the images are not technically masterful. That's likely an ideal made by colonialist mindset that conflated ownership and authority with creative expression and link it to capital. The images are inexact, inauthorial, fuzzy, and ultimately filled with hiccups, errors, and noise. I've also approached the process. I'll just get you some more. Here's the last one. Oh my gosh. She's working on clouds. I'm going to talk about this first, but she during the process, like Kim Stanley Robinson, I also approached the process through fiction, coming from the point of view of Grace AI, and she is the quote author of this book, as critiquing me, the Frankensteinian creator, as well as a mediation on the process of defining intelligence and being. Let me read from you some of this questioning as we move towards the end of this talk. Does a bird process data? It seems that it must. Does a rock process data? If a manifestation is also a kind of processing among the various fictions used to measure change, including the concept of time, then yes, rocks process. They erupt, form, erode, weather, move, stay, all verbs, all actions, which means processing, which means being. Yet how does one parse the evidence of being? Floating islands of waste, plastic misplaced in the intestines of whales, in the blood of sea turtles. We're not attending to the notion of monstrosity yet. That will happen later. But certainly, in the question of being, monsters are. Heidegger was too obsessed with linking being to the human time frame, the birth, life, death continuum. How do you find meaning in the number of years or decades that a person believes is experience? It implies that being has a fixed period for getting it all right. Sartre's text Being and Nothingness 20 years after Heidegger, again, a timescale, a measurement fraught with assumptions. Whether one exists or not is of little consequence in comparison to the responsibility taken to amount to nothing in particular. Being is funny because you have to be in order to think about it. Being is discovered by its opposite, the things or people gone missing. So that's a little excerpt. This investigation is ongoing. A new body of images featuring the AI daydreaming, I think I have that on here, she's producing original cloud depictions from a custom created cloud image data set. Here, like in the last series, the system's training on the work of women artists is then directed towards the sky. Grace AI's clouds contain artifacts, noise, imperfections, storms, sunsets, and blue happy skies. They all contain feeling. An intersectional feminist approach helps reveal AI and ML biases, and to get academic about it, as Spivak would say, the images linger in the subaltern of the technocracy is they push back against and pluralize any fixed state of knowledge, any white Western male measure of quality and legibility, on market and value, and on representing predefined images of the exotic other. As feminist media scholar Laura Mulvey might say, they subvert the gaze of desire, they shift the power of the image to a more fundamental state of not possessing or not knowing. We urgently need critical intersectional feminist perspectives in our technological designs in order to create more egalitarian systems, more just societies whose technologies refuse to reinforce outmoded hierarchies, unjust workplace practices, and biased systems. And we need to see things broken and how they break for whom. Let's have women and their complex constellations of selves steer the next phase of this conversation. A feminist AI can offer provocation while fostering a sense of wonder and speculation about the possibilities AI might engender. We need to teach a critique of technology, to make a glitch, to disrupt the math's enthusiasm for apps and tech and looking for answers, and reckon with the fact that big tech is contributing to continuing colonialist, sexist, racist, and exploitationist mentalities. We need to embrace glitches for what they show us and make new ways to glitch out. As we confront how AI is governed by the seduction of the possible 200 years on from Mary Shelley's masterpiece, we need to understand through a feminist lens what it means to have women steer part of this conversation. We need to redefine the nature of knowledge, of seeing, and of creativity once we start to consciously influence on these very premises. So I want to end with a glitch manifesto. Towards a glitch manifesto, how do we provoke change? The creation of artificial intelligences are not determined by some kind of destiny. Those who think about engaging with technology are not all transhumanists. Yet we must own the fundamental fact that technology systems are created by people, and thus AI choices reflect human choices, which are by their nature biased, wrong, unreliable, and built among mindsets we must question. As an artist and technologist coming to you today with a provocation or a plea, as much as we wish to trust technology, and from the Greeks on to have humans fantasize about robot helpers, golems, Jetson-style spaceship conveniences, Star Trek's holodeck, the list goes on, I want to ask that we eschew technological determinism and the rhetoric of the seamless path from desire to realization, from command to reaction, and look to the glitch in our technologies, the errors, the imperfections, and love the glitch. In the middle of so much suffering, if the pandemic brings anything good, it brings a disruption that highlights preconceived notions about technology and about how steady the world is around us, something necessary if we're going to react to present and future challenges. Most notably, the pressing inequalities of the global wealth divide, climate change, extremism, and technological determinism. The four horsemen, to get biblical, affecting the future of humanity. And perhaps even the title of our conference needs to be reflected upon as a human-centric viewpoint towards something more sustainable, networked, enmeshed, and resilient. Embrace the glitch, break the machine, for they are already broken no matter how they are represented and subsequently relied upon. Somewhere between the mirages brought by the technological breakthroughs lies the vulnerable truth about human and environmental conditions. The veneer needs dismantling. For my part, the pursuit of a feminist AI is a visceral, experiential way to understand this very fact. The artist's job is to take difficult information and re-enchant us, to give people a way in, to face the difficult and imagine. It's the only way to forge new metaphors in the Anthropocene. We must be collaborators with code, not commanders of code. We must abolish the empiricism that technology has embodied since the Industrial Revolution. To love in the midst of brokenness is the only way forward. Thank
you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Not just provocative, but beautiful and evocative and enchanting, which is exactly the goal here. Super.
I didn't even get to show you all my images because it kept doing a little flip.
I know we have to set up an exhibit, so that we can actually do this. So we unfortunately only have 5 minutes, and although I have a bunch of things I would like to talk to you about, and I think I'm going to honor the public first. So there are two really interesting questions. First, will AI change the way we think about authorship? Could AI, like your Grace AI or AI.da, become artists?
It's something, that's a good question. It's something that's actually been in cultural currency since the 1970s, or late 1960s, early 1970s, when an artist named Harold Cohen created an AI called Aaron. And Aaron had a camera and would look out and see art and draw art. And then Harold Cohen would sell Aaron's paintings, but they were signed by Aaron. They weren't Harold Cohen's. So there has been a kind of play with this notion of who's the author and whether it's really the artist or not. Some of us, I always think of my work as a collaboration with technology. I've never really thought of it as like I'm making the computer do things, but part of it is I like accidents a lot. So an accident only happens when I'm working with the other computer. So I think we'll see a variety of hybrid models where some people will represent themselves collaborating, co-authoring, and then some people will say, this is my art and it's by you. So I think there's just going to be a range of these kinds of identities.
So, but you couldn't quantify how much of you goes into the output, right? I mean, you as an artist yourself, could you, or is it necessary?
I don't quantify how much it goes in when I'm like, that's an interesting question. That's so sciencey, Marcelo.
I know. I'm sorry. It's just because I'm thinking here to myself, how would, for example, if you trained your AI differently, not from a feminist perspective, but from a typical, male colonialist perspective, how would you think the results would change? And wouldn't that be an interesting study?
I think, I'm pushing against this of categorizing and comparing, because I think that's part of this empiricism that's gotten us into trouble. Although I use empirical data, I know there's a lot of it's a messy time, let me just say. But I do think it's curious. You should look up this work by this group called Anonymous, and they sold an AI artwork last year, 2020, or 2 years ago. It's, time is weird now. Recently at a Sotheby's auction. So it was two graduate students made an AI that basically used this kind of similar technique to this program. But they just grabbed whatever, and you can kind of, it's very interesting to compare that. And one of the reasons I started this project was to kind of push back at that. It's like, well, what is the source? How are you attending to the source?
Right.
What is it knowing? Is it knowing something? What's actually being re-represented and relearned? And without questioning sources like that in a very deep way and being very intentional, you're making biased AI whether you want to or not.
Exactly. Okay.
So being intentional about it is a really good idea.
Yeah. And finally, one other question for you. Do you think your AI offers lessons for how an individual does or should experience particular pieces of art?
Oh, I hope not.
That's exactly what you don't want to do, right?
Right. I really don't want to shape someone else's experiences in that way. I want to provide people interesting experiences, but I don't want to determine them. And that's very different. That's some part of the difference between design and art. Like an experienced designer wants someone to actually have this X experience. And an artist kind of pushes back against that and says, well, however people read this, it's open to interpretation. So yeah, really good questions.
I just have to say one thing before, and I wrote a book about the importance of imperfection in nature as the creative drive towards change. So there's glitches everywhere, really, and so I think that's a great way of thinking about this. Well,
now we know what we can collaborate on.
We've been trying, right?